dark and fables tales. I know many of you come here to unwind, maybe even to fall asleep. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now, let the world around you fade away. Get cozy, close your eyes, and let the darkness of tonight's tale carry you away. Something felt off the moment I stepped onto the property. The air was too still. The tall grass surrounding the house rustled in strange, uneven patterns, as if something was moving, just beneath the surface. A pressure settled in my chest almost instantly, my heartbeat falling into a rhythm of quiet unease I couldn't quite explain. I had come alone, for what was supposed to be a simple task, just fix a few small issues for an acquaintance who owned the place. But was living abroad been routine, just a handful of days surrounded by nature and quiet. It felt almost accusatory event. The wind when it blows seemed to carry more questions than answers. It tried to brush off the initial sense of unease by reminding myself that I'd been before without incident. I would arrive on my maintenance jobs, then leave simple, but the moment I parked my truck in front of the old wooden house, an involuntary shiver ran through me. Cold sweat broke on the back of my neck and I swallowed hard. Maybe it was just the sudden dip in temperature or the fact that the sky looked permanently gray as though refusing to reveal even a sliver of sun. I grabbed my bags and headed into the house, flipping on lights to push back the oppressive darkness. I remember glancing at the large windows, feeling as if something beyond the glass might be watching. There was nobody there, at least nothing. I could see the first day passed uneventfully. I inspected the plumbing, fiddled with some wiring, and took inventory of tools and supplies. The property was extensive, but my focus was mostly on the house itself. In the distance stood a large old barn, more of a rickety workshop than a barn really stocked with tools. I rarely saw outside of museums or antique shops. There was an old tractor in the far corner, huge metal chains coiled on hooks, rusted sides, and wooden crates stacked precariously against the walls. Every time I glanced at that structure, I felt a tug in my gut as if that building had a heartbeat of its own. But I let it be, telling myself that I deal with any barn-related issues. Later, these night found me restless. The property's isolation, usually a source of calm, became unsettling when darkness fell. The only light in the house came from a single lamp in the living room and the small bedside lamp in my room. Every other corner seemed to linger in shadow. I tried reading, but this made every page turn echo, as if I were in a cathedral. Eventually, I decided to do a quick check around the premises, thinking a walk might help clear my head. Outside, the moon was partially obscured by clouds. My flashlight cut through the night, revealing tall grasses shifting in gentle waves each time it took a step. I expected to hear something scurry away, but there was only silence. The entire property felt strangely devoid of typical nocturnal life. No hooting owls, no chirping cricket, it's nothing. It was as though nature had collectively decided to hold its breath. It made my way toward the barn, more out of habit than necessity. That place always intrigued me because it was full of old tools nobody ever used. It was padlocked, not so much for security, but more to keep wild animals from wandering inside. As I approached, how the barn's rotted wood seemed to vibrate in the beam of my flashlight. But that was likely just my own trembling hand. It took a breath, inhaling the damp smell of earth and rust. My heart was pounding. Then I heard a low, soft whistle. Thought it must be the wind slipping through a gap in the barn structure, but the padlock and the door appeared intact, leaving nubious space for air to produce such a sound. I swept the flashlight around the exterior, scanning for a broken board or a missing slat. Nothing. The whistle persisted, carrying a small dod melody. I didn't recognize, a tune that seemed to rise and fall as though performed by someone waiting for me to follow. I felt a jolt of panic in my stomach, an immediate punch of adrenaline that made my hands shake. My breaths came in quick, shallow bursts. My first instinct was to assume someone was inside, but I had to ask myself how they got in. The lock on the barn door looked undisturbed, and nobody else was supposed to be on the property. I stepped closer, and the whistling grew louder. It was such a human sound, controlled, deliberate. It had a pattern, a sort of half-finished sequence that repeated every few seconds. My mind raced. If it wasn't wind, then who was making? I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the cold metal padlock. The frigid steel against my fingers made me told myself there must be a logical explanation, maybe an echo of the breeze. Then I steeled myself, unlocked the barn, and swung the door open. The whistling stopped so abruptly. I could have sworn it had never existed in the first place. Inside, everything was silent, pitch black. I flicked the flashlight in wide arcs, illuminating rows of antique tools hanging like trophies. The smell of dust and aging wood overwhelmed me, and I felt a surge of anxiety that manifested as a sudden dryness in my mouth. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. There wasn't even a rat scuttling in the corners. It forced myself to step in and search behind every crate, every shelf, even inside the old tractor's cabin. It was a brief but intense check fueled by a cocktail of dread and determination. Eventually, it found noon and nothing out of place. My pulse was thundering in my ears, and I was almost disappointed at the lack of tangible evidence, like it would have been easier to see a person lurking there than to face the alternative explanation that maybe something I couldn't categorize was playing tricks on me. I left the barn door, unlockingly in defiance of whatever had just taunted me. I returned to the house with my heart still in my throat inside. I locked the doors and tried to calm down with some water. My hands trembled and every noise in the house seemed exaggerated. 20 minutes passed, perhaps 30, and just as I started to settle into the uneasy comfort of the living room, I heard it again, that faint whistle, but this time it was right outside my bedroom window. The fear that gripped me in that moment felt primal, like my body went into some sort of fight or flight mode. Before my mind could catch up, my breathing ragged, my throat clenched, a thin line of sweat trickled down my back, and I clenched my fists so tight my knuckles popped. It stood up slowly and approached the window, every footstep ringing in my ears. The window looked out onto a small patch of dirt and sparse grass. The moonlight cast a pale glow over the scene, saw nothing except the swaying shadows of the property's boundary fence. But the whistling persisted, seeming to hover just beyond the frame. For a fraction of a second, I considered pulling open the curtains entirely to look out, yet some deep instinct made me hesitate. I eventually forced myself to check, flinging the curtain aside. The night stared back at me empty. The whistling stopped. I couldn't see anyone or anything. My flashlight, which I flicked on almost frantically, revealed not a soul. There were no footprints nor rustling in the bushes. No sign of a person crouching out of sight. It was just me in the windless stillness, but that sense of being watched, of being with, sank deeper into my skin. I swallowed hard and stepped away from the window, trying to regain composure's leap was impossible. My mind replayed the whistle over and over, dissecting every note of its fleeting melody. Eventually exhaustion forced me to lie down, but even under the blankets it felt exposed. Every time I closed my eyes, I had the vivid sensation of a presence standing at the window, pressing its face against the glass, patiently waiting for me to open my eyes. Again morning arrived in the form of a gray haze. I woke groggy, feeling anything, but rested. My neck and shoulders ached from tension and my hands were clam. Despite the cool temperature, I wandered outside to see if maybe daylight would provide some answers. The ground around the house looked undisturbed except for one odd detail. The barn door was now closed again. I distinctly remembered leaving it open. The padlock lay in the dirt, appearing as if it had been gently placed there, rather than ropped. My stomach twisted. It told myself maybe I'd forgotten to latch it, that a gust of wind had blown it shut. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been there. After I left, I decided to keep busy, hoping distraction would keep my nerves steady. I worked on small fixes, patched a leak in the roof, and tried to push thoughts of the barn out of my mind. But strange details kept surfacing. Tools in the storage had seemed rearranged, and the air inside had grown stale, almost suffocating each time. I glanced at the windows. I had the feeling something flickered on the edge of my peripheral vision, just a split-second presence that disappeared the moment it turned my head. By lunchtime, I was jumpy, heart pounding at the slightest sound in the late afternoon. Clouds rolled in heavy and thunder rumbled on the horizon. The atmosphere grew even more oppressive, as if the sky itself threatened to crush the land. I kept glancing at the barn, half expecting to see someone standing in its doorway, when a crack of lightning illuminated the property. I thought for the briefest art bat that I saw a shaped dart behind the barn. My breath caught and nearly lost my grip on the flashlight I was carrying. It told myself it could be my imagination or a trick of the storm. But the whistle that followed, distant yet unmistakable, told otherwise. Even with the thunder and occasional wind, I recognized that melody. It was the same pattern, the same eerie tune that seemed to tug my sanity. The storm was intensifying, but I couldn't ignore the compulsion to investigate. My steps toward the barn felt slow and deliberate, like I was wading through water. My heart hammered so hard I could feel my pulse in my temples. My palms were slick with sweat, and I had to wipe them on my pants before gripping the barn door. To my surprise, the door opened easily. Inside, the darkness was almost to total, broken only by the dim beams of my flashlight. The air smelled wet and metallic, as though someone had been polishing the old tools in a locked room. I swept the flashlight around, noticing deep shadows in the far corners where the light didn't quite reach. Every now and then, the lightning outside would flash through the small, grimy windows, creating split-second shadows on the barn walls that looked like elongated figures. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't make myself speak. My throat paralyzed. As I approached a row of large metal hooks, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. An involuntary shiver ran up my spine. Then came a faint rustling sound near a stack of crates. My heart pounded so violently I worried it might pass out. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but it needed resolution, inched closer, knees nearly buckling with each step. When I finally reached the crate's flashlight trembling in my grip, it found nothing but dust. Mows drifting in the stale air. A flash of lightning revealed something on the floor, a single footprint in a patch of dust. It was roughly the size of my own, but oddly skewed, like it wasn't made by a standard shoe. I crouched to examine it, noticing how the edges seemed smudged, almost as if the foot had twisted in place. Another whistle echoed from somewhere above me, faintly, yet maddening. My breath caught in my throat, and as napped my flashlight upward. The rafters overhead looked empty, but something scraped the stepped back, my calves pressing against a crate. In that moment, I felt more vulnerable than ever before, like every nerve ending in my body was on high alert. I backed out of the barn, never taking my eyes off the rafters, and slammed the door shut this time. I locked it firmly. The storm raged around me as I hurried back to the house, my mind spinning with possibilities I couldn't quite accept. Once inside, I bolted the doors, double-checked the windows, and sat down on the couch, trembling from adrenaline. I couldn't explain what was happening. Was it some intruder messing with me, or something less tangible? More insidious night fell quickly in the storm. The sky, an unbroken blanket of black. My surroundings felt claustrophobic, despite the fierce rain pounding against the windows. I could still sense the hush beneath the colloquy tension that refused to fade. Every rumble of thunder made me flinch, and each flicker left me scanning the shadows. I kept expecting to see a face at the window, pressed against the glass in a silent vigil. The hours crept by. I sat in the living room, the single lamp casting a weak circle of light occasionally. I thought I heard the whistle between thunderclaps, distant but persistent. My throat felt perpetually dry, and my muscles were so tense they threatened to cramp. I tried to reason with myself, to find a rational explanation. Maybe the wind could occasionally mimic a whistle, but the melody was too precise, too deliberate to be a coincidence. Sometimes the tune even seemed to shift slightly, as though reacting to my fear. Whenever I convinced myself it was gone, it would return faint and haunting sometime past midnight. The storm began to calm. At the lingering electricity in the air felt more potent than ever. The property fell silent on an oppressive hush that weighed on my chest. Exhaustion eventually forced me to lie down on the couch. I must have dozed off briefly, because the next thing I knew I was snapping awake with my pulse skyrocketing. My surroundings were dark, and for a moment I didn't know what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard a long, slow whistle coming from right outside the front door. My eyes darted to the windows. All locked, all covered. The door handle rattled slightly. My blood ran cold. Is that their paralyzed feelings? Wet trickled down my temples. The whistle sounded again, this time accompanied by the faintest tapping noise, like knuckles lightly drumming on wood. Every hair on my body stood one. My stomach churned, and I could barely breathe. I forced myself to stand, somehow mustering the courage to confront the door. My flashlight, flickering with low battery, cast a wan glow on the doorknob. Another whistle, impossibly gentle, drifted through the crack between the door and the frame. I don't know how long I stood there, muscles locked, unable to decide whether to open the door or run to my truck. My mind's whirled with paranoia, replay every bizarre event after what felt like an eternity. The whistling ceased, the tapping stopped. Silence. I waited, listening so intently. I could hear my own heart. I could almost sense a presence, backing away from the door. As a fact, acknowledging my unwillingness to let it in, my flashlight began to sputter, and in those final flickers I made a decision. I grabbed my keys, threw on my coat, and slipped out the back door to circle around to my truck. The night was still, and though I glanced around, expecting to see Hazel Howett in the darkness, is only the faint outline of the barn in the distance. Once I reached my truck, is that for a moment, with trembling hands on the steering wheel, the engines roar as it started. It almost made me jump. My nerves were shot, my body on the brink of collapse from sheer terror and exhaustion. I needed to leave, to get away from the property before that whistle returned. I drove off, not caring that it might be abandoning tasks left unfinished. Even as the farm disappeared in my rear view mirror, I felt the weight of something intangible pressing against my thoughts. The memory of that eerie melody still lingered in my ears. No matter how many miles I put between myself and that land, I couldn't shake the sensation that the whistling was following me, carried by the wind or lodged in my own mind. I never found out who or what was responsible for that haunting tune. In the end, I managed to finish just enough off the maintenance to fulfill my obligations, returning only once more in broad daylight to collect a few tools I left behind. I did so quickly, avoiding the barn altogether, but I could feel it watching, feel some presence on the edge of my periphery. Even after I was back on the road, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to catch sight of a figure or hear that faint whistle trailing behind me. To this day, whenever dusk falls and the wind picks up, I'm haunted by the memory of that singular, unsettling melody. It crawls into me dreams and pervades my waking moments, a reminder that sometimes the unknown is closer than we'll like to believe. And although I never discovered the source, I'm left with the abiding certainty that something out there was calling me by a whistle, sogently yet so terrifying that it marked me forever. A cold, sharp silences seemed to coil around my house that night, pressing against the windows and leaking in through the cracks beneath the door. The flicker of the television felt subdued, as if the images on the screen refused to shine too brightly for fear of drawing unwanted attention. I remember how the hairs on my arms stood on the moment I realized I was truly alone with my own heartbeat and the faint creaks of settling wood. It was just past 2 in the morning, and I was sprawled on my couch with a blanket pulled tight around my shoulders, surfing through channels in a futile attempt to drown out the uneasy quiet. That was when I saw it, something tall, dark, and fluid shifting in the reflection on the glass door that led to my backyard, a shadow I knew did not belong to me. I paused, breath catching in my throat, my eyes locked on the spot where I thought the movement had been. Cold sweat gathered at my temples and my mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was just the flicker of the screen combined with the reflection of a lamp. It turned around, Sylvester. I felt that whingy of pain in my neck, but my living room was empty, except for the furniture and the faint glow of the television. No shape, numinous figure loomed behind. The only sound was the soft crackle from the TV speakers. It forced a nervous laugh through clenched teeth, trying to convince myself I was simply one. After all, I'd been struggling with insomnia for days. My breathing was shallow, my heart hammering so hard I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. It told myself that illusions were common when exhaustion blurred reality. Yet as I looked again at the glass door, I had the distinct sensation that someone or something was out there, standing among the scattered chairs in my small patch of garden. The reflection of the night behind me felt its hould have been. As thought, the shadows had gained an extra layer of dimension, refusing to let paranoia get the better of me. I stood up and approached the door. My footsteps seemed to echo in the stillness, every creak of the floorboards magnified by the quiet when I pressed my face against the cold glass, all was my own paler reflection against the backdrop of the living room. The backyard was cloaked in darkness, except for the faint silver glow of the moonlight on a few leaves. I squinted, scanning every inch, straining to see if anyone was hiding among the bushes or behind the chairs. The only movement was the gentle sway of a tree in the chilly wind. It felt foolish for even checking my mind. Told it was nothing but a trick of the light, a momentary distortion caused by the difference in brightness between the TV and the dark yards. Still, I couldn't dismiss the crawling sensation at the back of my neck, a primal alarm that refused to be silenced. I locked the door, made sure the curtains were drawn, and tried to convince myself that a locked door would keep any threat, real or imagined, safely outside. Back on the couch, it flicked through channels aimlessly, the images on the screen blurred into a stream of flashing colors accompanied by the low buzz of the TV. My heartbeat had slowed, but I remained restless. Every sooften I found my gaze drifting back to the glass door, half expecting to see Uzzlehowit pressing against it. I also noticed my reflection gazing back at me each time. I thought about getting up to turn the lights on. A different kind of apprehension surfaced. Bright lights might reveal that something was there, at least in the dim glow. If a figure maybe it wouldn't appear so vividly. Maybe I didn't want to see it clearly. A couple of minutes later, the sensation of being watched grew unbearable. It felt as though invisible eyes bore into me from the darkest corner of the room. My mouth went dry and I gulped down saliva. My chest felt tight, as if I couldn't draw enough air to steady my racing thoughts. I decided it would be best to go upstairs. My bedroom provided a sense of sanctuary. 4 solid walls without glass doors or large windows that peered into the night. Clutching the handrail, I crept up the stairs, listening for any noise that didn't belong. The house responded with its usual moans and creaks, each one amplified by my frayed nerves. Once inside my bedroom, I locked the door out of pure instinct. My breath was still shallow, and I could feel the cool sweat running down my back. I sank onto the bed, leaving the lights off, thinking that maybe if I pretended to sleep, the feeling of unease would go away. Perhaps I could fool my mind into slumber if it stayed still enough, but sleep refused to come. The mattress felt hard, the pillow seemed too hot, and then my skin prickled, as if electricity danced over it, making every hair stand. I thought about turning on some music or searching for a meditation upon my phone, but something in me hesitated. It felt as if making any noise would alert whatever presence lingered outside, if it was indeed outside at all. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I decided I was being paranoid. People see shadows all the time, especially when exhausted. I recalled half-remembered stories about individuals catching glimpses of movement in their peripheral vision. Scientists attributed that phenomenon to the brain's pattern recognition going into overdrive. I told myself I was simply another tired man who needed rest. Strolling onto my side, It started at the faint glow that seeped through the curtains from the street lamp outside. My eyelids grew heavy, and for a moment, I was drifting off. Then I heard a subtle scraping sound, so quiet it almost blended with the hum of my own thoughts. It froze me, body tense. The sound came from somewhere below, as though something was brushing up against the back door. I held my breath, unsure if I was truly hearing it, or if it was just the pounding of blood in my ears. I rose from the bed, feeling my knees tremble. My chest felt constricted, and my palms were slick with sweat. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror on the wall, and noticed how pale I looked, eyes wide like a cornered animal, their flexion unsettled, reminding me of that earlier distortion I had seen in the glass door downstairs. I stood there trying to convince myself to check the hallway to make sure everything was still fine, but annoying fear told that if I went downstairs, I might see something I didn't want to see. The scraping sound came again, followed by a soft rustling. My heart pounded to the point of pain, and a metallic taste. Mouth unable to endure the uncertainty, I forced myself to open the bedroom door and step into the upper hallway. It was too dark. It was switched on a small table lamp. The hallway felt narrower than usual, and the walls seemed to close in on me. I strained to hear any repeated noise when nothing came. I moved step by cautious step to the top of the stairs and peered down. The living room was veiled in darkness, and the only indication of something was a faint glow from the still active TV screen, which I had forgotten to turn off a flicker on the screencast. Dancing shadows on the wall. Could it have been the TV that caused their reflection earlier? The rational part of brain clung to that idea, but that earlier sensation of being watched refused to let go. My mind replayed that moment again and again, the tall dark shape merging with mine in the reflection, summoning courage. I didn't believe I possessed. I descended the stairs, stepping as lightly as possible, the floorboard still me with each creak, and I felt certain that if there was something lurking in the house, it already knew exactly where I was. My mouth was soddery. I could barely swallow, and a cold sweat trickled down my forehead. A primal adrenaline spike kept me moving. My muscles ached with tension. Finally, I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood at the threshold of the living room. The TV illuminated the room with a cold blue shimmer. My gaze fell on the glass door, now only partially obscured by the curtains I had drawn earlier. That sense of dread intensified as he fanned unseen. Weight pressed against my ribs, drawing a shaky breath. I crept closer to the door. Then, in the faint reflection cast by the TV light, I noticed the shape. Only this time it was more distinct, a tall, featureless outline standing just behind me. In the reflection, my stomach twisted in terror, and I lurched around, arms raised defensively. But I was alone. The shape was gone from the reflection. My heart so oddly that I could barely hear the sound of my own gasp. Every hair on my body stood on. The living room was empty. The reflection had been so vivid, waves of cold spread through my limbs, and I felt a surge of lightheadedness. I staggered back, nearly tripping over the edge of the carpet. I thought to myself that maybe the figure was not in the house, but rather inside the reflection itself, like some warped presence of overlapping my own shadow. The idea made no logical sense, but I couldn't shake it. A movement in the corner of my vision made me whip my head around. The curtains shifted slightly. Thought there was no breeze to move them. It was as if something had brushed against the fabric from the outside. My breath caught, and I reached out to pull the curtains aside, then stopped. Did I really want to look into the darkness again? My hand shook uncontrollably, but I gritted my teeth and yanked the curtains open. A quick, involuntary hiss escaped my lips when I saw the backyard. It looked entirely empty. The chairs were arranged just as I had left them, the small garden motionless in the windless night. Yet the glass itself seemed distorted, rippling like a thin film of water. Instead of a solid pane, my own reflection appeared, stretched, my face elongated, mouth opening in an expression of silent horror. It felt an urgent need to confirm that I wasn't imagining things. Clenching my fist, I rapped my knuckles against the glass. It felt solid, but he always subtle shimmer at the point of contact, like a dark ripple that spread outward before vanishing. My breath caught, and I stepped away. The reflection flickered, and once again the tall silhouette seemed to loom just over my shoulder, then blinked out of sight. My instincts screamed for me to get out of the retreat back to my bedroom, or possibly leave the house altogether. But my legs felt rooted to the floor. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I realized I was breathing in quick, shallow pants. The air felt stale and heavy, as though whatever lingered in the reflection had seeped into the room and was now standing right behind me. My arms prickled with goosebumps, and my heart pounded against my chest so hard I feared it would burst. Refusing to succumb to the paralyzing grip of fear, I pushed away from the door. My mind leaped from one desperate thought to another. I considered calling someone, maybe a friend, to talk me down from this panic, but it was nearly 4 a.m, and I had no idea what I would even say. I imagined describing the events to another person, and realized how absurd it would sound. A strange shadow in my reflection, a door that ripples like water, They would tell me to get some Restore, see a doctor. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to slow my breathing after several frantic chart beats. I forced myself to think clearly. I repeated a silent mantra, it's not really. You're just seeing things. This is insomnia messing with your head. The more I repeated it, the more small measure of calm returned to me. My breaths came easier, and the frantic drumbeat in my chest settled into a steady thrum, stealing my nerves. I decided to check every corner of the house to prove to myself there was no intruder one by one. It turned on lights. The kitchen was just as I'd left it, with a couple of dishes in the sink and no sign of forced entry. The bathroom, next to the living room, was empty, the shower curtain still drawn back, as I had it by the time I completed my circuit of the downstairs. I had rechecked the door locks, tested the windows, and confirmed everything was secure. The only place I avoided was the glass door. The more stayed away from it, the less. It felt the weight of those eyes, that oppressive presence. Eventually I decided I should try to rest. It turned off the TV, leaving the living room in darkness, and headed upstairs. My legs trembled with every step, exhaustion and anxiety weighing me down like lead. I left the bedroom light on this time, unable to face the thick darkness. It must have drifted in and out of a restless doze around. Daybreak, I opened my eyes to see the first pale rays of sunlight seeping through the curtains. The morning light dispelled some of the terror, but an uneasy tension gripped my chest. I got every muscle itching with fatigue and steeled myself to check the living room again in the brightness of day. The glass door looked ordinary, no ripples, no distorted reflections. My yard was tranquil. The chairs sat in neat rows, and the few flowers in my small garden were undisturbed. Devon saw that nagging feeling of having been watched clung to me. I had an almost inescapable sense that some fragment of that shape still hovered in the corner of my vision, as if waiting for dusk to reclaim its power. The memory of that tall silhouette loomed over my thoughts, and the recollection of the glass rippling beneath my touch was as vivid as any waking nightmare I had ever experienced. I wished I could dismiss everything, ask the delirium of a sleepless night, but my racing heart and lingering dread told a different story. Something had invaded my home, even if it left no footprints or broken locks. It might have remained in their reflection, bridging the boundary between my world and some unsettling dimension just beyond ordinary sight. In the weeks that followed, I covered the glass door with thick curtain, one that blocked the faintest glimmer of light. The moment the sun began to set, I would draw that curtain closed and avoid the living room. If I could, sometimes while upstairs in bed, I would catch myself holding my breath, convinced I'd heard a faint scrape against the glass, or the whisper of movement beneath the door. On those nights I hardly slept, trunning through frantic possibilities in my mind, imagining elongated figures and merging shadows waiting just outside my field of vision. Yet life continued, and I somehow managed to get by with less and less sleep. Friends occasionally commented I looked exhausted, but I only offered vague excuses about stress and insomnia. I could never bring myself to explain the real reason. The events of that single night remained imprinted on my thoughts, lurking like a bruise that refused to fade. Eventually I made a decision. I wouldn't allow that presence, whatever it was, to dictate my life forever. One evening, I found myself standing in front of that glass door, once more curtain in hand, as the last amber rays of sun dipped below the horizon. My pulse raced, but this time I refused to close the curtain. I opened it wide, instead letting their reflection come into full view. My own eyes stared back at me, and behind that reflection stretched the growing darkness of my yard. For a momental eyes was my tired, haunted expression. No shadows flickered, and the glass did not ripple. I'm not sure if that's the end of it, or merely a lull in something much larger. Even now, I step closer and see me face in the glass. I half expect a glimpse of that shape looming over my shoulder. A chill still caresses my spine when I recall the electric tension in the air, the sense that two realities were overlapping like mismatched puzzle pieces. The memory alone is enough to keep me alert every night, listening for the slightest hint of movement in the backyard. Maybe I did see something that night, or maybe my tired mind conjured a phantom out of loneliness and fear. Either way, the sensation of those unseen eyes on Mailingers buried somewhere in my chest like an invisible weight that compresses my ribs. When the house is dark and silent, I can't say I'm at peace, but I'm still here, and in the end, perhaps that's all one can hope for in the face of a dread we can't quite numb. Remaining watchful, refusing to yield, carrying the memory and the mystery with me into each new day. Yet, even as I write these words, I glance at the glass door and brace myself, wondering what I might see the next time I dare to look. Darkness pressed me from all sides, a suffocating weight that made every breath feel shallow. The wind whispered through the pine trees like a warning, rustling their branches in irregular pulses that set my nerves 1G. Even the moon, a weak pale glow, seemed powerless against the immense shadow of the mountains. I had never felt so insignificant under ASCII. That should have been serene instead. Felt like the night was watching me, conscious of my presence, waiting. I had come here with two close friends for what we hoped would be a serene getaway, the promise of crystal clear mountain air and the thrill of being far from civilization had convinced us to plant this strip 4 months. We set up our 3 tents in a rough semicircle, each just a few feet apart, so that we could share supplies and keep an eye on one another. Though it wasn't my first time camping, something about this particular region made me feel a late ace from the moment. Where the landscape was dramatic, jagged peaks, dense forest, and sparse trails that wound like serpents around the mountainside. The isolation was absolute. Cell phone reception vanished before we even reached the dirt road that led us. Our first day passed uneventfully, though. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that we had stepped into a domain that didn't want us. The sunset behind the mountain, surely plunging our campsite into a prolonged twilight, built a modest fire and shared stories of previous outdoor adventures. While my friends seemed perfectly at ease, I felt a constant prickling at the back of my neck, as if invisible eyes were upon me now and again. I was certain I heard a light scraping sound like branches against stone, or maybe something more deliberate just beyond the trees, trying to dispel my unease. I crawled into my tent sometime around midnight, zipping myself into my sleeping bag. The outside world seemed to close in quickly. Soft scuttling noises drifted in on the breeze, and the dense silence of the mountains weighed on my thoughts. I told myself it was just natural forest life, small animals moving under the cover of night, and that I should be thankful for the experience. I dozed, eventually lulled by the muffled hush of the wilderness. A few hours later, as napped awake, my heart was pounding so hard that my ribs felt bruised, disoriented, and covered in cold sweat. I held my breath, trying to understand what had startled me. The darkness inside my tent was thick, but I could detect a low crackling noise, the unmistakable sound of plastic being crumpled. It was fainty at closes, though someone or something was rifling through our supplies. The realization left me with a surge of dread. My breath came in shallow bursts, while a fine tremor spread through my limbs. After fumbling for my flashlight, I unzipped the tent door just enough to peer outside. The night air was piercingly cold, and my lungs seized at the sudden chill. With a shaky hand, I pointed the flashlight beam around the camp. 2 tents flanked mine, forming that near semicircle. The middle one belonged to one of my friends who had already turned in before. Meat's entrance flap was closed from the outside, but something about it felt off. A creeping chill prickled the back of my neck as I noticed that the tent appeared oddly flat, almost deflated. Despite being fully zipped up for a moment, I aimed my beam at the supply bags, expecting to find them toppled or rummaged through, but they were untouched. The dryness in my mouth intensified as I realized that nothing looked out of place. It tried to steady myself, telling my heart to slow down, but a dreadful sense of being watched made it impossible to calm down fully. I forced myself out of my tent, fully aware of how vulnerable I was in that moment. Gravel crunched softly under my boots as I took slow steps toward my friend's tent. The air felt charged, as though a storm were about to break. The beam of my flashlight wavered across the brightly colored nylon. I called my friend's name initially in a strained whisper, then louder. When I got no reply, I repeated it again, my voice echoing awkwardly into the silent dark. No response, no stirring from inside. The tension in my neck twisted tighter for a heartbeat. I considered walking over to my other friend's tent first, but an invisible push compelled me to reach the empty one. Immediately after swallowing a lump in my throat, I crouched down under the zipper. The quiet rasp of metal teeth gliding open seemed impossibly loud in the oppressive hush of the night. My flashlight revealed what I dreaded. The inside of the tent was empty. Noon inside, no sleeping bag unrolled, no sign of recent occupancy, just some scattered gear and a half-eaten protein bar, as though whoever had been there left in a hurry. Chills swarmed over my skin, and my pulse hammered in my ears. My friend had mentioned earlier that he hadn't brought any climbing equipment or fishing gear, so the likelihood that he would wander off the hour was minimal. Panic wet at me. Where would he go? I had specifically discussed not exploring the surroundings in darkness. I thought I heard a faint shuffle deeper in the woods. It was the kind of noise that stops you in your tracks and sets your hair wand. It felt a strong compulsion to investigate, but an equally potent fear urged me to stay close to camp, trying to keep my voice level. I called out again, scanning the dense undergrowth with my flashlight just as to catch some sign of movement. There came the unmistakable sound of rapid footsteps on damp earth. The steps were quick and deliberate, and they retreated deeper into the forest with alarming speed. My stomach dropped. The footsteps were too heavy to be an animal like a fox or raccoon, but they didn't belong to any of my friends. Either not with that unearthly swiftness, hitting the urge to run. I walked toward the sound with my flashlight pointed ahead. The night beyond our camp was nearly impenetrable, the trees forming a black wall only a few yards away. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I found nothing. Footprints, no broken branches, no sign of intrusion. The ground was wet from previous rainfalls, I expected to see at least some indication of movement. But the earth was unmarked, my breath quickened, turning shallow and ragged. A sickening sense that I was being lured away crawled through my mind each step. It felt the aviarth and the last ace of invisible hands tugged at my ankles to keep me from straying further for a long moment. I stood on the boundary between the campsite circle of light and the forest's blackness, scanning the darkness. I heard nothing more. My flashlight picked out only gnarled trunks and tangled foliage. The mountain breeze carried the scent of wet pine, giving me the unsettling impression of being inside some creature's dark lungs, each breath measured and watchful, feeling unsteady. I forced myself back to our circle of tents, my head pounding with uncertainty. My friend was missing, possibly. I thought an intruder was lurking nearby, though. I couldn't fathom the motive. If it was a thief, why not take the supplies? Why just slip in and vanish? Without a trace, when I returned to my tent, I half expected to find someone there rummaging through my things. My flashlight beam shook in my hand, and I could barely swallow, my mouth so dry that my tongue felt like some paper. I tried to calm myself, telling my trembling hands to relax, to no avail at length. I decided to wake my other friend stumbling over. I unzipped his tent, the stirred awake. Immediately startled by the brightness in his eyes, I described the situation in breathless, fragmented sentences. She listened, and in told Meth that it hadn't thing. His expression revealed concern, but also a hint of doubt. Maybe our friend had just gone out to relieve himself or decided to take a short walk. Still, I couldn't ignore the gut-wrenching certainty that something was deeply wrong. We checked around the perimeter once more, finding nothing unusual. Ultimately, we decided there was little else we could do at the hour. I returned to my own tent and tried to rest, though sleep was nearly impossible. My heart did in my chest, and every rustle of foliage made my nerves jolt. Eventually, exhaustion went out, and I fell into a restless dream, tortured doze. When I next opened my eyes, the harsh light of early morning blended me. Took a few seconds to remember where I was, and the terrible moment of realization washed over me like ice water. I quickly got up, my muscles aching from the tension of the night. Outside the campsite looked deceptively peaceful. The sun made the dew on the grass sparkle, and a mild breeze carried the scent of pines and rich earth. But my stomach lurched again when I saw my missing friend standing beside his tent, fiddling with a metal cup as if nothing had happened. My other companion was beside him, pouring water from Athermos. I marched over, ignoring the gnawing ache in my limbs, and demanded an explanation. My friend seemed baffled, insisting he had been in his tent the entire night, and that I must have been mistaken. There was no reason for him to goot in the middle of the night. He was adamant, confused but resolute, that I must have had some vivid nightmare. I felt my blood run cold. I had seen his tent empty. I had heard something moving around. I had seen his gear abandoned, and he stood there looking as though he had slept soundly. My other friend, observing our exchange, frowned and tried to reason that stress or exhaustion might have caused me to imagine the whole thing. Still, I remembered the footsteps in the woods, the plastic crumpling sound, the unzipped and empty interior of that tent. My heart pounded with fresh urgency, and my skin broke out in a cold sweat. There was no way I had hallucinated. All of it was spent the morning checking the surroundings more thoroughly. The DL-laden ground didn't show any footprints apart from disturbed, and the interior of my friend's tent, which I was sure had been empty just hours before, now had his sleeping bag laid out. Every sign pointed to him having been there all night like he claimed, yet I couldn't shake the prickling sense that some intangible presence was toying with us, warping our perceptions of reality throughout the day. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, convinced I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting shape that vanished whenever I turned my head. My friends grew irritated with my jumpiness and reminded me not to spoil the trip. They told me in more patient tones that I probably needed more rest, but the tension under my skin refused to subside. Even the crisp mountain air felt stifling, as thought the atmosphere itself had thickened with menace. Ace Vening approached again. A gray haze settled around the peaks, and the wind picked up, carrying a mournful howl that resonated through the valleys. It sounded eerily like someone calling out in distress. My heart knocked against my ribs each time the wind gusted. Wetty quick meal in near silence, my anxiety so high that I barely tasted the food. The entire day had been overshadowed by my lingering doubts and confusion, and the prospect of another night made my breath come quicker, determined not to be caught off guard again. I decided I would keep watch for a while, after retreated to our tents. As darkness fell, a suffocating sense of dread consumed me. I zipped myself inside my thinilon shelter, but the barrier felt laughably inadequate against whatever lurked in those woods. Every rustle, every whisper of movement made my skin crawl. My flashlight was clenched in my fist, and I ran through every possible explanation for what I had experienced the previous night. Rational logic offered little comfort. and the creeping paranoia returned full force at some point. I felt my eyelids grow heavy, my mind drifted between waking and images of the empty tent and phantom footsteps looping in my head. Then out of nowhere, a muffled thud pulled me back to full alertness. My pulse hammered so violently that it tasted iron in my mouth. Slowly, I unzipped my tent door just enough to peek outside. The night was starless, overcast, sky swallowing the moonlight. I lifted my flashlight, scanning the campsite. My breath caught in my throat when I saw a tall figure at the edge of the clearing. It stood unnaturally still, as though carved from the darkness itself. Before I could even react, the figure turned and drifted away into the trees, too smooth, too silent. My skin erupted in goosebumps. Everything about it felt wrong, as if I had glimpsed something that shouldn't exist. I wanted to chase after it, confront it, or at least verify it was real. But my legs refused to obey. Every cell in my body screamed to stay put, a hide. Eventually, I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control the trembling that had seized my muscles. It stayed like that for what felt like hours, half crouched in my ten-scene trance, flashlight pointed uselessly into the void. There were no more sounds, no crinkling plastic, nor retreating footsteps, just the punishing silence pressing on my ears until they rang. When dawn finally broke, emerged to find everything exactly as before. Tent flaps closed, supplies intact, my friends leaping or pretending to sleep peacefully. Yet my world was irreversibly changed. Each subsequent breath felt fragile, as though any small noise might shatter my composure. After my friends woke up, I recounted what I had witnessed, this time in an unsteady but urgent manner. They exchanged uneasy looks, uncertain whether to humor my explanation. One of them remarked I was pale and shaking, insisting I should get proper restore. Maybe we should cut the trip short. I agreed to leave that day. We dismantled our campsite under a brooding sky that threatened rain. My missing friend from the previous night remained adamant that never left this tent, even repeating that he hadn't slept well but was definitely present. I didn't argue further. Something told me the truth was beyond a simple debate. I packed up my gear with trembling hands. The memory of that silent figure seared into my mind as well loaded our belongings into our vehicles. It felt a subtle sense of relief that we were departing those dark mountains, yet their relief was tainted by a persistent disquiet. That place had allowed us to leave, but it had taken something intangible from me. My certainty, my sense of reality. Even now, days later, I can still feel the cold night air against my face, and still see the outline of that figure in my peripheral vision whenever I close my eyes. Sometimes late at night, my mind replays the rustling sound of plastic, the empty tent, and the vanished footsteps in the damp earth. I find myself wondering if I'm haunted by some trick of my imagination, or if that remote mountainside harbors forces beyond comprehension. All I know is that my friend insists he was there in his tent asleep and unknowing, while I recall an empty space where he should have been. The contradiction weighs heavily on me. I haven't been able to fully shake the feeling that something else was walking among us in the darkness, something that could shift perception like a twisted mirror. Perhaps it was just a neckhoof, the land itself. Or perhaps it was something far more disquieting, quietly observing us from the depths of that ancient forest. No matter how many nights I spend in the comfort of my own home, now I can't chase away the memory of that oppressive night. Whenever I drift off to sleep, I brace myself for the possibility that I might wake up again to the sound of plastic crumpling in the darkness, my heart pounding in my throat, the adrenaline roaring in my veins, only to step outside and find something vital missing. Yet somehow still there, even if I never set foot on that mountainside, again the fear remains a companion that lurks just beyond the flip. At edges of my understanding, it whispers that some experiences can't be explained, only endured, and that what lurked between our tents might follow me. Wherever I got, the night pressed down on me like a heavy blanket, making every breath feel thick with the promise of something I couldn't name. My tent was a small pocket of light in a vast expanse of darkness, pitch at the bottom of a canyon whose towering rock wall strapped every faint tick of wind and distant rustling in the daytime. I knew this place as a playground for adventure, sharp ridges perfect for rappelling, majestic formations that soared against the sky at night. However, those same walls seemed to close in and loom over me like silent, watchful sentinels. The sense of exposure felt overwhelming, as if a single misstep could tip the balance and send the entire cliffside crashing down. Yet I forced myself to settle and to breathe, to embrace the solitude. It was supposed to be aged away, a time to reconnect with the raw essence of nature and my own bravery. I was lying on my back inside the tent, soap and letting the darkness swallow my surroundings. My heartbeat was already elevated, a dull thawing in my ears, not from exertion but from attention. I couldn't quite shake. The canyon floor was colder than I anticipated, and an unexpected dampness seeped through the tents. Space despite the dryness of the desert. Ere the day's exhaustion tugged me, my eyelids felt the abbey, but just as I began to slip into a fitful sleep, I caught a faint movement on the rock walls outside. A weak glow shimmered across the stone, dancing slowly, as though controlled by an unseen hand for a moment. I tried to dismiss it as starlight, or maybe their reflection of the moon, but not. This was deliberate, a beam of light sliding across the rugged cliff surface. My body tensed and my pulse quickened. I became intensely aware of every sound, or rather the lack of them. No footsteps, no quiet fume of a car engine, or campsite chatter. Not to suggest another person had arrived at the canyon floor. Still, that glow continued its crawl, moving a couple of meters up the vertical wall, then pausing. Its pace was painfully slow, deliberate. I sensed my palms getting clammy and my throat felt parched as it tried to swallow. I recalled earlier that evening, before the last threads of sunlight vanished, I had scanned the valley and noticed other tents, no parked vehicles, no sign of fresh footprints. The fact that a now's all mysterious beam of light flickering across the canyon face didn't line up with the total isolation I had observed. The contradiction noted at me, fueling a low vibrating dreading my stomach. There was noon here. It told myself, or at least there wasn't supposed to be determined if it was a person with a flashlight. I grabbed my own lantern and with a trembling hand unzipped the tent flap. The chill night airs lapped me, intensifying the goosebumps that were already forming. I pointed my lantern at the wall, aiming grimly at the place I had last seen the glow. I blinked rapidly, my eyes trying to adjust to the sudden brightness of my own beams. Lowly, I moved it in a friendly, signaling manner, a clear attempt to communicate with whomever might be out there. Where my heart drummed in my ears and sweat pulled at my lower back despite the coolness of the night. I waited, no flicker in response, no shift in their positioning. Nothing but the silent thush of the canyon. Then, without warning, the original glow disappeared altogether. My breath caught in my chest. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, scanning the towering wall for any sign of the flickering. The darkness around me felt thicker than before, as though it had swallowed the faint glow and swallowed me too. A part of me wanted to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a camper who didn't see me signal, or someone who switched off their flashlight. But an uneasy voice in my mind insisted that something didn't add up. Usually you hear people clambering around, especially on a rocky surface. Any movement on the canyon walls should produce the crunch of gravel or the slide of loose stones. I heard nothing. The absolute stillness weighed down on me so intensely that my own breathing sounded deafening. I ducked back into my tent, sealing the flap behind me. Inside, my little sanctuary felt less secure now. Every rustle of fabric made me jump, and I kept expecting to see the glow return, perhaps shining directly into the tent. My chest felt tight, and I noticed how shallow my breath had become. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick. I sipped from my water bottle, but it did nothing to soothe the rising apprehension. The water felt tepid, sliding down my throat in an almost nauseating way. It tried to force myself to sleep, telling myself that if I rested I'd feel more clear-headed in the morning, but every time my mind began to drift, some subtle sound, a rock shifting outside, or maybe just my imagination, jerked me back to full alertness. My tingled, asif, unseen eyes were drilling into me from the darkness when I did doze off for a few minutes. I woke up with my heart pounding, uncertain whether I'd heard a whisper or dreamed it. It was like being trapped in a half-sleep state, where the boundary between reality and imagination was impossibly blurred. By the time early morning light was shed across the canyon, I felt more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. The dawn revealed everything in a stark, cold clarity. The imposing walls, the jagged rock formations, and my lonely tent in the middle of it. Tallest stepped outside and stretched, painfully aware of how stiff my muscles felt. It was as thought the tension had coiled into every fiber of my body, leaving me throbbing and unsteady. I remembered the stories I had heard from fellow climbers, tales of strange lights in remote places, illusions caused by atmospheric conditions, or distant hikers that vanished by evening. At times these stories came off as local legends or cautionary fables. No standing in the chilly morning sun, I was no longer sure if those accounts were just rumors. Later that day, it tried to focus on why I had come in the first place, to rappel down some of the more challenging cliffs or dup, and made my way toward a section I had scouted previously. The midday heat baked the rocks, and the canyon chowed with the calls of birds circling high above. For a while, the physical exertion of descending steep face with a rope took my mind off the midnight. Paranoia, me breath dragged from adrenaline and effort, and my sweat stung my eyes. Rappelling always gave me sense of exhilaration, a controlled exposure to danger that usually energized me. This time, though, it felt a persistent note in my stomach, an unshakable sense that I was no longer alone out there. I caught myself glancing up at the cliff edges repeatedly, half expecting to see a flicker of light in broad daylight. Nothing appeared, but the sensation of being watched refused to leave the sight. Off the canyon felt natural, as though every living creature had decided to keep its distance. Echoes of my own movement staunted, making me wonder if footsteps echoed from behind, or if I was only hearing my own boots dislodging small stones several times. I paused, holding my breath to see if the shifting sounds would continue. Without moving in those moments, my pulse hammered so loudly in my ears that I couldn't hear anything else by evening. I was both physically spent and mentally. One Jimmy plan had been to stay for a couple more nights to really immerse myself in the canyon's rugged beauty, but the memory of that dancing light and the dread that came with it made me hesitate. I debated packing up and leaving while there was still daylight, but a stubborn part of me refused to fear dictate my actions. I set up a small campfire, its flickers, ending long shadows stretching across the ground. The light seemed to distort the shapes of the rocks, twisting them into silhouettes that swayed and bent with the dancing flames. As darkness fell again, my nerves wound tighter. I told myself I should eat, that a good meal might ground me, but my appetite was gone, replaced by a knotted feeling in my gut. The very act of chewing felt forced, so I gave up after a few bites. The wind picked up and the canyon began its eerie chorus of howling gusts and clattering pebbles. I stared at the fire, trying to blot out the primal fears, stirring in my mind occasionally. I thought I spotted movement at the edge of the flickering firelight, just outside the ring of illumination. My heart kicked into a higher gear each time, but I never found anything real upon closer inspection. Eventually, the fire burned down to embers, and it was time to face the tent. Again, my breathing felt too loud, as though each exhale might attract attention sliding into my sleeping bag. I tried to rationalize every noise. The wind sometimes creates illusions, I reminded myself, when it hits the canyon wall. At certain angles it can produce whistles and moans that sound almost human once or twice. I was convinced I heard a low hum like a deep chanting carried on the breeze. My heart pounded so hard, I could feel the throb in my neck. A cold broke out across my forehead some hours into the night. I jolted awake. I wasn't sure what had roused me. My eyes darted around the tense darkness until I registered a faint glow filtering through the fabric. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a surge of adrenaline spike through my limbs. For a moment, I thought perhaps dawn was breaking, but the angle was all wrong. This was not the soft, diffuse light of morning. It pulsed, slightly moving just beyond the thin layer of nylon. My entire body started shaking. I wanted to scream or call out, but the fear froze my tongue. My mouth was soddery. It felt like and paper straining to control my trembling. I reached for my lantern. My hands fumbled in the dark, brushing against the cold metal. I clicked on, and the warm glow inside the tent gave me a small sense of security. Then, in a moment of sheer dread, I unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. My eyes slowly adjusted, and I saw that the faint glow was no longer on the high canyon walls. It was on a nearby boulder, not more than a few meters from my tent. It drifted across the stone surface at an impossible angle, as though it wasn't just a light but a presence. I felt my heart hammering so violently that I worried I might pass out. There was a gnawing sense that I was witnessing something beyond my understandings. Wit dripped down my temples, and I had to force myself to keep breathing, so I wouldn't hyperventilate. Every instinct screamed at me to zip the tent shut, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the glow. It pulsed softly, shifting from one side of the boulder to my mind struggled to label it an optical illusion, a trick of the moon, or reflection from some hidden metallic object. But the more I watched, the clearer that this glow was moving with intent. Paused occasionally, as if studying me, then resumed its slow dance. My body was overtaken by chills, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on. If felt a tightness in my chest, the primal terror that comes from an encounter with something you can't explain and can barely comprehend. My thoughts spiraled. Was it a person with some advanced gear? Was it something that defied natural explanation? I recalled an older Clemmer once describing a phenomenon in remote areas, lights that seemed to have a will of their own. He had said in a hushed, serious tone that if I ever encountered them, you should look away, because when you stare too long, they might just stare back. At the time, I had dismissed it as superstition, yet now that warning felt all too real, resonating through my mind like a frantic alarm. A sudden gust of wind swept through the canyon, rattling the tent and stirring up a small swirl of dust outside. The light flickered erratically, then disappeared behind the boulder. My vision blurred for a second, and I wasn't sure if I had truly seen it vanish, or if it had merely moved out of my line of sight. Darkness settled once more, an oppressive claustrophobic blackness that felt alive. His lump-back chest, the aving heart battering my ribs for the rest of that night. Is a upright in my sleeping bag, my lantern flickering, weakly eyes darting around the tent. Thought the walls themselves might close, and when dawn finally arrived, I was still shaking, every muscle in my body screaming with tension and fatigue. I crawled out of the tent and inspected the spot where I had last seen the glow. The boulder looked ordinary, just a slab of rock with a slightly weathered surface. There was no sign of footprints, no scuff marks from shoes or equipment. Running my hand over the stone, it felt a persistent trembling in my fingers, as though some residual energy clung to the surface. My rational mind told me it was just my nerves, but a deep Part of me suspected otherwise. I forced myself to eat a quick breakfast and hastily packed up my gear, my eyes continuously scanning. The ridges above the silence weighed on me, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I questioned my own sanity. Could I have imagined it all conjured by the isolation and the echoing hush of the canyon? But the memory of that dancing glow felt too tangible, its slow, deliberate movements etched into my mind like a scar. Despite wanting to cling to logic, I couldn't bear to stay another night. I strapped my pack on, feeling the sweat of anxiety sliding down my spine. My throat still burned from dryness. The climb out of the canyon tested my endurance, especially given how little rest I'd had, but each heave of my legs took me closer to open ground and away from whatever had haunted me. In that valley, once I reached my vehicle, I paused, looking back one last time at the colossal rock walls. The sunlight had turned them gold, making them appear grand, almost inviting, yet I couldn't shake the conviction that something hid within those shadows, something that watched and waited. As I drove away, the sense of relief was immediate, but my pulses stayed elevated and a cold sweat clung to my skin. For miles 7 now days later, my mind cycles through the same questions. Did it truly witness a phenomenon that defies easy explanation, or did my own fears manifest into something that felt real each night? Since my sleep has been fractured occasionally, in that liminal space between wakefulness and slumber is a faint light dancing at the periphery of my vision. I bolt upright, heart racing, only to find myself alone in my dimly lit bedroom. That persistent dread won't let me go, as if some part of the canyon followed me back whenever I close my eyes. I recall the silent glow creeping along the rock face, independent of any mortal hand. The realization that I can't definitively explain it has left me with an nagging sense of vulnerability and an unsettled certainty that some mysteries are best left undiscovered. Even now, as I recount these details, my pulse quickens and my palms grows liquid sweet. No matter how it tried to rationalize it, the memory remains vivid, drifting radiance in the dark, responding to nothing. I did dance, wearing no questions and offering no clues to its origin. It remains out there on those canyon walls, waiting for anyone who dares to camp in that lonely stretch of land. The experience has woven itself into my nightmares, a trembling reminder that true terror doesn't always roar or lunge. It can float silently just beyond the edge of your vision, waiting for a moment of weakness to reveal itself, and then slip away without leaving a single footprint behind. I woke drenched in a sense of foreboding, my heart thawing against my ribcage like a desperate animal trying to break free. The air around me felt charged, like a storm was about to rage, but there was no rain, no thunder, only the quiet immensity of a far-flung river mile from the nearest city, and the thin walls of my tent between me and whatever lurked in the darkness. This was supposed to be a simple fishing trip, a escape from the routine of daily life, yet in those silent, suffocating pre-dawn hours, I could not shake the feeling that something watched from beyond the canvas, waiting. I had left eerily the previous morning, eager to reach a secluded spot along the river that a cowworker had mentioned. He said it was a fisher's paradise, untouched by weekend crowds and the usual noise pollution. The drive was longer than I expected, winding through lonely roads that seemed to stretch into endless swabs of forest. By the time I got the sun was perched high. The day was scorching, but the breeze across the water offered some lee. I cast my line, hoping for a few hours of serenity. However, fish were scarce that afternoon. I caught one small trout, barely enough to justify the excursion. Their real prize was the stillness of the place, no hum of chat from distant strangers, just the sound of the wind whispering through the trees, the lazy ripple of water against the rocks, and the occasional bird in the distance. It was a soundscape that both soothed and unsettled me, because the isolation was so profound. I started imagining shapes in the corners of my vision. Once I glimpsed a figure across the river, tall and shadowy, but when I focused it vanished. I told myself it was only the flicker of sunlight on the water, and forced a calm exhale. I had intended to pack up and return home before sunset. But the hours slipped away too quickly. When I finally checked my watch, the sky was already streaked with hues of orange and red. I made the call to set up my small tent near some large boulders and a flat patch of earth, not far from the riverbank. It seemed safer to stay the night, rather than risk driving back on those twisting roads in darkness. As I hammered the last tent stake into the ground, an odd sensation nagged at Milik. I was being watched. The trees around the clearing were silent. No leaves rustled, no birds called. The sudden hush made me skin lettering to brush off my unease. I built a small fire using broken branches and driftwood found along the bank. The air cooled drastically after sunset, and the crackling flames were a comfort against the encroaching blackness. The only sounds were the night insects chirping and the soft glugging of the river. Every sooften, I caught a rustle behind me, some small creatures scurrying in the brush. I assumed it tried to blame my nervousness on the unfamiliar environment, convinced that I was just a city dweller out of his element. Eventually I crawled into my sleeping bag. The flames outside dimmed to glowing embers, and even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. I fell asleep to the lull of the river's current, letting their rhythmic flow numb me mind. Hours later, I awoke to the distinct crunch of twigs snapping underfoot. It was closed, definitely less than yards from my tent. My muscles tensed immediately in the darkness. Every sense felt amplified. My eyes flew open, heart rattling in my chest. I tried to control my breathing and stay as silent as possible. There is a certain cadence to a human footstep, something you distinguish from an animal's scuttling. What I heard outside had that cadence's low, deliberate steps circled the perimeter of my campsite. The thought of calling out to warn away an intruder crossed my mind, but dread answered my tongue. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my stomach twisted with a sudden wave of nausea. Strained to listen. The steps paused near the entrance of the tent, then resumed again, moving in a wide loop around the area. After what felt like an agonizing eternity, the crunching receded into the distance, unable to settle back to sleep. I lay still for at least another hour, my mind teetering between logic and panic. Perhaps a lost thiker had stumbled onto my sight, or a hunter was passing through, or it could have been someone simply curious about my presence. Yet something about the pacing, the heavy tread, made me question those possibilities. There was an intention in those steps that felt wrong, invasive. By the time the sky started to lighten, I was wide awake, my eyes gritty from lack of rest. The dawn brought with it a sense of fragile relief. I unzipped the tent, cautiously scanning my surroundings for any sign of an intruder. The area looked exactly as I had left it the previous night, except for fresh footprints left in the damps of earth. They were wide boot prints, the tread suggesting heavy outdoor gear. These prints looped around my tent, a crazy pattern, no clear direction or purpose, just circles and figure eight. It was as if someone had been pacing aimlessly, or maybe trying to intimidate me. Every hair on my neck stood on when I recognized that these footprints came dangerously close to where I had been sleeping. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a surge of cold sweat across my forehead. Kneeling down to inspect the prints, and noticed the depth. Whoever wore those boots was either very large or carrying something heavy. The ground was still moist from the previous day's drizzle, so the footprints were crisp and fresh. They had not been made earlier in the day. They were definitely from the night before. I thought about packing up immediately, but a stubborn part of me wanted to know who or what had been skulking around. Determined, I followed the footprints a short distance into the surrounding brush. They led about 30 or 40 yards away, weaving between trees and shrubs until the vegetation grew denser. Then they simply vanished, as though the person wearing those boots had lifted off the ground. No broken branches, no set of prints heading in another direction. I felt Tennessee knot in my stomach, the abrupt end of the trail. If a hunter had decided to check out my campsite, why abandon the pursuit in such a random spot? A creeping sense of unreality began to set Nasif. This was some bizarre dream. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a local who didn't appreciate strangers on the land. Or perhaps I was just so exhausted that I overlooked more footprints and got lost. Yet something inside me whispered that the explanation wasn't that simple. Despite my rising paranoia, I decided to stay another night. Part of me felt stubborn. I hadn't caught much fish, and I didn't want to let fear dictate my actions. Another part of me, though, was morbidly curious. I told myself I'd be prepared if the footsteps returned. I had a strong flashlight and a camping knife, and I could drive away at any moment if necessary. The rest of the day waste tense. I couldn't relax. Even as I cast my line into the river, the sunlight reflecting off the water seemed too bright, almost painful to the eyes. My every breath labored, my chest tight with underlying panic. I thought I saw shapes moving in the trees beyond my peripheral vision, but whenever my head, there was nothing but trunks and foliage. Once I heard what sounded like a whistle, low and almost melodious. It echoed through the grove of trees. I froze, glancing around to see if someone was nearby, but the whistle never repeated, and noon emerged. By late afternoon, the clouds gathered overhead, stealing away what little warmth the day had offered. The wind picked up, rustling the canopy of leaves in an eerie, whispering chorus. My eyes darted around the landscape, seeking any hint of movement. I felt that unshakable sensation of being observed, as if unseen eyes tracked my every move. The fleeting comfort I had found in the stillness of the day was gone, replaced by a kind of grinding anxiety. As the light waned, I rebuilt the campfire with trembling hands. The snap of the kindling seemed deafening in the hush around. My stomach churned, and each breath came too quickly. When darkness finally descended, it felt the avier than the night before, as thought the gloom itself had thick. Everything cast dancing shadows on the rock and trees, warping them into grotesque shapes. I tried to calm myself by imagining rational explanations. Perhaps I was spooking myself with ghost stories in my own head. Perhaps those footprints belonged to a camper who'd spotted my tent and thought to have some fun at my expense. But the tension in my body refused to subside. My hands were slick with sweat, and I caught myself flinching at the smallest crackle of the fire. At some point, I drifted into a fitful doze, hunched near the dying flames. Dreams plagued me. Images of tall figures shrouded in darkness, peering at me from behind the boulders in one fleeting vision. I saw something humanoid but distorted, with elongated limbs and a face that hovered between man and shadow even when is napped awake. I couldn't fully shake the impression that those shapes lingered just out of sight. It was close to midnight when I heard again the crunch of leaves and twigs, a deliberate footstep. My chest constricted, and I held my breath, pressing my back against one of the large rocks. For cover, my flashlight was in my left hand, my camping knife in my right. My heart pounded so violently. I feared whoever was out there would hear it. The steps moved closer, almost teasing in their slowness. It felt my throat gather, and my mind screamed at me to confront it, to shine the beam of light in that direction. But I was too terrified. Then the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound itself. I forced myself to flick on the flashlight, sweeping it across the camp. For an instant, the beam caught something, a shape that darted behind a tree. It was gone. Before I could register details, still it was enough to send me into a surge of raw panic. My breath came in ragged gasps, and a cold wave of adrenaline shot through my veins, making me feel both hyper-alert and oddly dizzy. No voice called out in a greeting or explanation, offered the presence, whatever it was lingered on. Reveling in my mounting terror, I stayed rooted to that spot for a long time, unable to move. I tried telling myself that the figure was just a camper, or maybe even an optical illusion. Yet the primal fear and gut insisted otherwise. This was something beyond a random passerby. The night seemed charged with an uncanny energy that made every hair on my body stand on. Eventually, I decided I could not bear another hour of that dread. I shoved everything I could into my backpack, barely caring about organization, and dragged my tent down in half. The time it took to stop, my hands shook so badly that I fumbled with the poles. The entire time my nerves were one, just certain that I would feel a hand on my shoulder or glimpse a silhouette creeping up behind me. The forest was too quiet, as if every living creature had fled, leaving me alone with this presence. When I finally threw my gear into the trunk of my car, I felt a rush of relief so strong I almost laughed. The idea of driving those winding roads in the dead of night suddenly felt less terrifying than spending another minute exposed in that clearing. I started the engine headlights, illuminating the trees ahead for a split second. I thought I saw the faint outline of a tall figure just beyond the reach of the beams. My vision blurred with panic, and when I blinked, the shape disappeared. It sped away, the darkness swallowing the campsite behind. Even as I drove, I couldn't rid myself of the sensation that something pursued me. The shadows in my rearview mirror seemed to ripple and shift. My fingers clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white, as if letting go even slightly would allow the dread to overpower me. I stayed on high alert, convinced that a pair of wide-booted footprints might appear on the side of the road if I looked for them. When I finally reached as a vast stretch of highway, a wave of exhausted relief washed over my mind still danced with visions of that impossible pattern, footprints and the shape that vanished behind the trees. I told myself I was lucky to have escaped before anything worse happened, but escape felt like the wrong word, implying something truly dangerous was out there. It's been several days now, when I can't seem to shake the tension in my muscles or the unease that haunts my dreams. When I confided the story to a friend, he suggested it was probably just some weird or roaming the forest, or perhaps a trick of the mind born from isolation and too little sleep. I tried to reassure me that there's nothing in those woods that could truly hurt me, and nodded along, but felt no comfort in my gut. I knew I had experienced something beyond a simple prowler. My body remembers the visceral terror the moment my breath caught as I realized those footprints were human-sized and yet utterly foreign. Now whenever I close my eyes, I see the circling prints in the damp earth looping around my tent in nonsensical designs. I heard their rhythmic snap of branches. The darkness sensed that oppressive silence when the footsteps stopped. A chill crawls up my spine every time I recall how they disappeared, without a trace. I find myself questioning whether it truly saw the outline of a figure behind that tree, or if it was just a manifestation of my own growing paranoia. But somewhere in the recesses of my mind, I'm certain something was there, something that watched and waited. Eventho, I managed to leave that campsite physically unharmed. Part of me remains strapped in those woods. I can't shake the image of those footprints. Aimless yet deliberate, flayed out by a presence that thrives on fear at night. I still jerk awake to the memory of that slow, low crunching sound, my heart racing, sure that any second I'll hear it again outside my window. I've started double-checking the locks on my doors, looking behind curtains and under my bed for footprints or muddy boot marks. It makes no logical sense. Yet I can't help it. I've tried rationalizing everything. Telling myself is succumb to an overactive imagination, yet in quiet moments I recall the atmosphere of that clearing, the stifled air, the hush in the trees, and that unrelenting feeling of being watched. I might pretend that the incident was a harmless encounter with a stranger, but I know better. Whatever circled my tent that night, It felt more like a force than a person, something that took pleasure in my terror, though I may never fully explain what happened. The memory of those footprints remains etched in my mind, an enduring reminder that sometimes the darkness holds secrets we're not meant to understand, and that knowledge follows me wherever I go, wrapping around my thoughts like a shroud, leaving me forever uneasy when night falls. From the moment I first stepped into that abandoned industrial building, I felt something was wrong. The air seemed to cling to my skin with an unwelcome humidity, and an almost inaudible hum pulse at the edge of my hearing. It was as thought the very ground beneath the structure shuddered with an irregular heartbeat, a distant vibration that refused to settle. I had been sent there on a routine structural inspection, but within minutes, I knew this job would be anything but routine. The sunlight filtering through the cracked windows felt dimmer than any right to be, as if the building itself was devouring the light before it could reach my eyes. My breath felt caught in my chest, and my heart began to pound. No matter how many times I reminded myself I was just there to check beams and pipes, I couldn't silence the unsettling sensation that I was trespassing in a place never meant to be disturbed. I had taken this assignment because I was the only one with enough open time in my schedule to travel all the way to that remote corner of the countryside. The client had purchased the property on a whim, believing it could be renovated into a usable warehouse. My task was to investigate the condition of the sublevels where old pipe and support columns ran these cund. I walked toward the reinforced steel door that led underground. I noticed a faint trembling in the ladder, as though something was shaking the entire frame of the building. I paused at the top of those metal rungs, trying to figure out if it was just my nerves. Then I placed my hand against the door's surface, and I felt a low buzz that reverberated up my arm. It stopped suddenly as it started, leaving me with a cold sweat on my brow, and the distinct impression that the structure itself was alive to spit my unease. It made me way down into the subterranean level. My flashlight revealed corroded pipes and rusted walkways overhead, thick cobwebs tangled in the steel beams, and the air had the stale taste of old machinery. I kept telling myself it was just another inspection, that strange noises and minor tremors aren't unusual in neglected industrial buildings, yet each time the vibration returned, it seemed to come in irregular bursts of about 5 seconds. I found my pulse racing uncontrollably. I couldn't identify the source. There was no visible machinery running, no humming generator in the corner, no ventilation system, just the sporadic quiver of metal under my feet, accompanied by a muted thrum that felt more organic than mechanical. By the end of my first day there, I had run through every plausible explanation. I told myself it might be distant truck traffic, maybe heavy farm equipment out in the fields, but deep down I knew that made no sense. The property was surrounded by overgrown farmland, abandoned years ago, and there was nothing but an empty road leading to the main highway several miles away. That night, I could barely sleep. My mind kept wandering back to that pulsing tremor, the way it made the beams resonate, as if the structure was breathing every time I closed my eyes. I saw twisted metal corridors shifting under an unseen force, waiting to swallow me whole. When I returned on my second day, I arrived early, determined to get thorough reading on the building's structural integrity. The sky was gray, the morning fog clinging to the weeds around the main entrance. As entered, in August, the silence was heavier than before, almost suffocating. My boots scraped against the concrete floors, and every step felt amplified, echoing into the gloom beyond my flashlight's reach. I spent hours carefully checking the beams, measuring the thickness of corroded sections, noting down stress fractures occasionally. I could hear wind whistling through the broken windows above, but beneath that waste the same ominous hum that would come and go in irregular intervals. I grew jumpy, my hands began to tremble. Each time Themo groaned in response to that unknown vibrations, what trickled down my temples and the back of my neck tingled with the unmistakable feeling of being observed. That afternoon, I decided to explore the SUV in more depth, hoping to find old motors or hidden power lines that could explain everything. I discovered narrow corridors branching off from the main pipe chamber. They were lined with decaying insulation and half-buried conduits. My flashlight flickered over peeling paint and decades-old grime, and I felt my stomach tighten with each step. The corridors seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning, leading to locked doors and small storage rooms that had been gutted of anything valuable. It was in one such corridor, as I was examining an ancient access panel, that the vibration started again. This time it felt stronger, like a sudden quake that rattled my teeth. My heart thudded against my ribs and my breath caught in the throat. The metal under my feet trembled, and I dropped my flashlight for 5 terrifying seconds. The corridor appeared to ripple, as if the walls were shuddering in protest against an unseen presence. When it stopped, I fumbled to retrieve my flashlight, my palms sweating so much that I nearly lost my grip on it. There was no logical explanation, yet I sensed something Massive shifting deep below the foundation, an impossibility that gnawed at my mind. I recalled conversations with the property owner during which they had mentioned the building's age, the unknown expansions done by previous owners, and all the local folklore that surrounded it. I remembered them implying that the workers who once labored there were left for reasons. Beyond economic downturn, they had murmured about strange occurrences and an oppressive atmosphere at the time. I dismissed those remarks as superstitious small talk, but standing therein that flickering light, every word came back to me with a new weight over the next few days. My attempts to pinpoint the source of the vibrations, LED now hair, I used every device I had, listening equipment, ground-penetrating sensors, moisture detectors, and still I came up blank each evening. I would return to my hotel with my nerves shot, my body shaking from adrenaline and anxiety. It tried to convey what I experienced in my progress. Reports I used professional terminology referencing unidentified structural resonance and unexplained ground disturbances. But their reports failed to capture the dread that clung to him when I was down in those corridors. The sense that with every quake some colossal entity beneath the ground was stirring to life. My colleagues, reading my messages from a distance, seemed skeptical. They suggested that perhaps the building was on an old fault line, or that local geological shifts could be to blame. Some recommended electromagnetic interference tests. Others simply advised remain calm and keep searching. Their tone was sympathetic, but uncomprehending. One of my superiors mentioned through an email that if I couldn't find a concrete reason for the tremors, the client might abandon the project altogether. I recall feeling equal parts relief and disappointment at that possibility. Relief because I wanted out of that building, and disappointment because I feared I would leave without understanding what lurked beneath. On my final day of inspection, I arrived with a feeling of intense apprehension. The interior was darker than usual, as the sun was obscured by thick clouds. The air was cool, yet it felt stifling. My first destination was the largest open chamber in the sublevel, where I'd previously seen the thickest pipes. As I descended the ladder, I heard the hum again and my pulse quickened. This time, it didn't come as a short jolt. It started low and droned for several seconds, building in intensity until the metal beams overhead began to shiver audibly. My stomach knotted, and I realized I was holding my breath. The noise then tapered off, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. That was when I noticed something in the far corner of the chamber, a section of the wall that appeared to be vibrating on its own like a faint ripple dancing across its surface. My flashlight illuminated a patch of brick and concrete that didn't match the rest of the wall pattern. The mortarland were uneven, and some bricks looked like they had been hastily shoved into place, despite every fiber of my being screaming at me to stay away. I found myself drifting toward Ed, compelled by a need to understand. My hand over the bricks. They were oddly warm, wet beaded on my forehead, and my breath came out shallow. I pressed my ear to the wall, and I detected a deep rhythmic pulsing from behind it. My heart pounded so hard that for a moment I couldn't separate my own body's throb from the strange beat inside that wall. My mind raced with questions. Was there some kind of hidden machinery, an underground spring, a bizarre resonance phenomenon? Determined to see more, I retrieved a small hammer from my tool bag. It tapped the bricks lightly, and an echo bounced back, hollow and distorted. With trembling fingers, I worked on one of the loose bricks, prying until it clattered to the ground. Darkness waited behind the opening, too narrow to see much. I fished my flashlight inside, straining to glimpse. Whatever lay beyond the beam revealed a pocket of empty space and something that glistened softly. As the light passed over it, it looked like metal, but it had an organic sheen, an almost wet surface that pulsed faintly in sync with the vibrations. I'd been feeling my skin crawled. I felt dizzy, as though reality itself had warped. I backed away, heart racing. Hammer slipping from my hand, my throat tightened with panic. My legs threatened to give out, but I forced myself to remain upright. The pulsing grew louder, more rapid, as if whatever was on the other side of that wall had sensed my intrusion. The entire chamber began to tremble, and grits ifting down from the ceiling. My flashlight flickered, threatening to plunge me into total darkness. A wave of nausea rolled through Mesum. How I knew I was standing at the threshold of something it should never have uncovered. In a rush of self-preservation, I turned and scrambled for the exit ladder, ignoring the small scrapes of metal tool. Dropping from my belt, every step felt like an eternity as the chamber shook, the beams groaning with another worldly resonance. By the time I emerged into the ground-level factory space, I was gasping for air, my lungs burning. The vibration cut off the moment I cleared the sublevel entrance, as if an invisible boundary had been crossed. I stood, the red dripping sweat, my heart pounding in my ears. I drove away from that sight with my teeth clenched, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. My immediate recommendation to the client was to abandon the project for the sake Of safety, there was no rational explanation for the structural anomalies I had observed, and it felt an overwhelming certainty that no standard renovation could rectify what lay beneath. They ended up taking my advice, and the property was left alone, even after I submitted my final report. The visions kept haunting me, the image of that faintly pulsing surface behind the wall, the sensation of the entire building. My feet. I found myself waking in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, convinced I could still hear that unnerving thrum sometimes when I'm half asleep. Is where I can feel my bed shaking for just a moment, and I'm taken right back to that underground chamber. My heart races, and for a split second, I'm certain I haven't truly escaped whatever I disturbed weeks past, and it tried to bury the memory in my mind, chalking it up to stress or some bizarre phenomenon that I misunderstood. But late one evening, as I was heading home from another inspection job, my car rattled with a strange vibration that lasted just long enough for me to recall the exact feeling of metal trembling. Underfoot, my chest tightened, and beads of sweat dotted my brow. The trembling ended abruptly, leaving no trace, but the dread it summoned remained. In that moment, I realized I might never fully rid myself of the impression that something ancient, hidden, and impossibly vast lurked underneath that deserted building's foundation. I have no plans to return, and no further reason to explain myself to anyone who might doubt my story yet. The experience lingers in my thoughts, creeping in during silent moments when I least expect it. The memory of that low pulsing hum resonates in my skull, and I can't help but wonder if it still calls out underground on, waiting for someone else to come close enough to sense its impossible heartbeats. Sometimes I question whether there was something real behind that wall at all, or if my mind was unraveling from the stress of long days in the dark. But deep down, I know what I felt, an ancient mechanism or presence is slowly awakening. And no matter how far I run from that building, I can still feel its pull, as if part of me is forever trapped in that trembling darkness below. I remember how the darkness settled in that first evening. Suffolk, it felt almost tangible. The path leading to the cabin was nothing but a muddy track slithering through tall looming pines. There was no glow from a neighboring porch, no headlights from passing cars, not even a flicker of a distant window. It was an emptiness so vast that the sound of my own steps seemed ominous from the moment I arrived. A faint dread crept to my thoughts, as if the absence of noise concealed something that should have been there. Yet I told myself it was simply the unease of solitude, or maybe the tension that comes with being cut off from the world. No cell service, no internet, no comforting hum of civilization, just my breath, chewing against the silent trees. Still, I was determined to make this cabin my refuge for the next few weeks. I had come to this ecological reserve for peace and needed a place to work on a personal project, something deeply important to me. The caretaker, an older man with serious eyes, had warned me that there was no phone reception, and that the area was known for its isolation. He had mentioned in a neutral tone that I should stay attentive to the weather because the cabin roof was old and could be slippery in the rain. I brushed off his remarks as polite caution, but I felt a flicker of unease when heard in a quieter voice that some visitors didn't last long. In that secluded spot, people tended to leave sooner than expected, citing the intensity of the stillness or the incessant rustling of the pine branches. Hadn't say more, and I didn't ask. I simply nodded, paid for the key, and hauled my luggage inside. When I stepped into the cabin, I found a small living area with a sofa, wooden table, and a creaking bookshelf lined with old, dusty novels. The walls were plain timber, and every sound in it reverberated through the space. I could hear the floor planks complaining whenever I shifted my weight. The single bedroom was cramped but clean enough, with a bed that smelled faintly of mothballs. The caretaker had left me a short note with basic instructions about the fireplace, the water supply, and the generator that provided intermittent electricity. According to him, the power might flicker during storms despite its simplicity. I told myself it was enough for my needs. I even felt a small spark of excitement at the idea of total isolation, imagining how the quiet would fuel my writing. The first few days were uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whenever I sat at the table to type, I caught myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting a figure to appear at the door. At night, I often woke to unfamiliar sounds, a distant snapping of branches, the low groan of timber expanding and contracting. I reminded myself that houses in the woods make noises. That's what they do, especially old ones exposed to the wind and cold. My chest would tighten for a few moments, but eventually I drifted back to sleep, telling myself I was simply overreacting. By the end of the first week, rain clouds moved in, shrouding the forest in a perpetual gray gloom. An unrelenting drizzle coated everything, including the cabin's roof. Caretaker's warning about slippery tiles came to mind. I glanced outside occasionally to confirm noon was around, but the rain created a veil that made it impossible to see beyond a few feet. It tried to focus on my writing, determined to push aside the eerie calm that had settled inside my bones. The absence of sunlight, the hush of the pines, the monotonous drip of water from the eaves, all of it felt increasingly oppressive. My breathing grew shallow as if I couldn't quite catch a full lungful of air. Late one evening, well past midnight, I was still awake or reading a worn novel I had found on the bookshelf. The only light in the room came from a single bulb that flickered. Whenever the wind surged, my heart was already winged from the unstable illumination, each brief moment of darkness sending a tremor through my hands. I told myself to calm down, to concentrate on the text in front of me. That was when I heard the first series of footsteps on the roof, soft, deliberate, like someone. Carefully to avoid slipping, my heart pounded so hard, it felt as though my ribs would crack instinctively. I froze, listening to each measured step. There was a distinct pattern, as if whoever or whatever it was had a slow, cautious gait at first. I wondered if it might be imagining it. The rain of 10 played tricks, especially on roofs with old tiles, but this was too precise to be mere rain. I turned off the light and stood in the dark, the book still in my hands. It's as if that fragile paperback could offer any protection for several seconds. The footsteps continued in a rhythmic pattern, thence eased abruptly. The silence that followed felt suffocating, my ears almost straining to catch any return of that movement. I flicked on my flashlight, grabbed the cabin's old umbrella, and stepped onto the porch. Shiver coursed through me, not just from the cold drizzle, but from the dread whirling in my stomach. As wept my flashlight across the roof and around the perimeter, nothing was out of place. Lantern of footprints in the mott thing that hinted at an intruder. The rain fell steady stay. A relentless curtain of water. My flashlight beam revealed only the dark outlines of the trees. The wind hissed through the pines, seeming to whisper in a language I couldn't comprehend. I stayed out there for a while, scanning every possible angle, feeling the raindrops seep into my jacket. Finally convinced I would find nothing, I returned inside, bolted the door, and dragged a small cabinet in front of it for additional security. My thoughts were frantic, bouncing between logic, maybe it was just the creaking roof, and a raw animal fear that said something was on top of the cabin, toying with me. Within minutes of settling onto the sofa, I heard it again. This time the steps were slower, heavier, as though someone was searching for something. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my breath came in ragged surges that left me lightheaded. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I realized I was gripping the arm the sofa so tightly my knuckles ached. My skin felt clammy, the trickle of sweat in the back of my neck contrasting with the cold, damp air. I wanted to rush back outside and confront whatever was up there, but a paralyzing fear rooted me seat. There was a sense that if I opened that door again, I might invite something into the cabin that I wouldn't be able to control or understand. Sleep was impossible. I just sat there in the darkness, flinching whenever a branch cracked or the wind rattled the window occasionally. I thought I sensed movement in the corners of my vision, shadows darting along the walls, but whenever I turned my head, nothing was there. My rational mind argued it was simply the flicker of the flashlight or the uncertain glow from the storm-lashed moon. But the pounding of my heart refused to believe those reassurances. Then I found myself whispering reassurances, to noon in particular, reminding myself to hold on until morning. When dawn arrived, its pale light little comfort. I forced myself outside, determined to check the roof in full daylight. My stomach churned with nausea, and I felt unsteady on my feet as if I had been awake for days, climbing up on an old wooden stool. I carefully ran my hand along the edge of the roof, expecting to feel cracked tiles or find some tangible sign of disturbance. Nothing, no loose panels, no footprints, no broken branches above. It was as if the footsteps had never happened. Yet I knew what I heard, and the memory of that slow, deliberate pacing made my skin crawl. I decided then that my stay in the cabin needed to end. My nerves were shot, and my sense of reality was wavering. I gathered my notes, stuffed them into me duffel bag, and tidied up the cabin, anxious to depart before nightfall returned. While packing, I occasionally thought I heard faint echoes in the hallway, but they vanished. The moment I stepped in to investigate, at one point, I was sure I felt the floor quiver under my feet, as if someone was stepping behind me, but the cabin was empty. My heart hammered, and I felt a surge of dizziness, like the walls were closing, and sweat clung to my forehead. And I had to close my eyes to steady myself. I recalled something the caretaker had once mentioned about people leaving early because they couldn't let the stillness. However, my experience was not mere stillness. It was an active, oppressive force. Before locking up, I stood in the living area for a long moment, gazing at the dusty bookshelf and the table where I had been working. The shutters were open, allowing in a dull gray light that flickered across the floorboards. I realized I was holding my breath. A persistent thought nagged at the back of my mind. Perhaps the footsteps on the roof were only the beginning of something more insidious, something that thrived on seclusion and fear. The caretaker's cryptic tone echoed in my ears. He had never specified what exactly made people leave the cabin ahead of schedule. He had only hinted that the quiet hair was unlike any other as it finally stepped onto the porch and scanned the tree line one last time. The drizzle had lessened and the forest looked ghostly, the damp trunks glistening in the pale light. It felt a prickling on the back of my neck like I was being watched from the treetops. My stomach ched again, then came a subtle sound, an almost imperceptible shift, like the weight of a body rebalancing on wet timber. I looked at the roof's edge, but saw nothing yet. My heart raced and my breath caught in my throat. A part of me considered climbing up there again, if only to prove it that I wasn't losing my mind. But my hands trembled so violently that I couldn't gather the courage. The sense of an unseen observer was overpowering, an indescribable awareness pressing down from above. I hurried to my care, each footstep into mud feeling heavier than the last the moment. It turned the key in the ignition. It felt a wave of relief, albeit tinged with lingering dread. My reflection in the rearview mirror led me. My eyes were bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. My skin was unnervingly pale, my lips were dry and cracked from the tension of the night before. I took a deep breath, fighting the tremor in my chest, then steered the car back down the winding path. Every souffle, often I glanced at the rearview mirror through the drizzle. The outline of the cabin disappeared among the trees like a memory dissolving into the landscape as I drove. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had settled onto the roof again, watching me leave the forest on. Either side of the road felt unnaturally silent, save for the faint dripping of rain on leaves. It felt like I was escaping from a place where the boundaries between what's real and what lurks in the recesses of the mind had begun to blur. The caretaker's words replayed over and over in my head, though I had no proof that he knew anything more than Helaton. But somehow it felt like he had expected my eerie departure. He had seen it happen before. Visitors unnerved by something intangible, something that defied explanation, even now safe home. I often wake in the middle of the night, convinced I hear footsteps overhead. My heart drums frantically against my rib cage, and for an instant I'm back in that cabin alone, listening to deliberate steps across old drain's lick tile. Sometimes I get up to check my own roof, running my flashlight beam along the shingles from the upstairs window. Even though I know there's noon there, I cling to the logic that my urban roof is impossible to access from the outside without a ladder, yet the adrenaline spike, the sweaty palms, and the dryness in my throat persist. I have tried explaining the incident to friends without resorting to vivid detail. Most respond with polite sympathy or mild skepticism. It might be describing a vivid nightmare. I occasionally mention that I believe I heard something real out the reen intruder animal of presence, but it never stay on. The topic for long, the memory of those soft, careful footsteps sends a jolt through my nerves every time. I recall the mitzvah piece of that cabin followed me home, tainting the safety of my own bed and roof whenever rain patters against my windows. I tense up listening for that measured tread, waiting for it begin again. Despite all the logical explanations, our raccoonal loose branch, the shifting of ancient timbers, none truly satisfy me. Yet there was a deliberate quality in each footstep, the unhurried pace, the weight behind every movement, the sudden stops that suggested an alert and sentient presence in the dim glow of memory. I can still sense its malicious curiosity and intent that cannot be brushed off as random woodland phenomena. Something watched me from atop that cabin, and while I'm in age to leave, I cannot forget the way my gut twisted with every thump on those old tiles. I still see that caretaker's eyes in my mind. They had looked solemn, almost pitying, as she handed me the key. He must have heard the stories of strange encounters more than once, but maybe he learned that some things are better left unspoken. Perhaps that's why he gave me only the vaguest cautions, trusting that the place itself would deliver the true warning, and it did, though I escaped with my sanity intact. But I remain haunted by the intangible silhouette that paced above me in the night. I can still feel its shadow pressing down, an inexplicable weight that no locked door could keep out to this day. Their collection leaves me uneasy appet in my stomach that refuses to vanish. My dreams are stained with the vision of wetals and creeping footsteps surging me to remember what I heard. That isolated cabin. Sometimes I wonder if I should go back, just to confront the source. Perhaps standing in that space again, shining a light upon the roof, would offer clarity. But I cannot bring myself to make the trip. The sense of something unanswered looms over him, a whisper in the back of my mind that says, say some doors aren't shut off to remain sealed, and every time it trains, I cannot escape the dreadful suspicion that what haunted Mether might one day find its way into my life, again stealthily treading above my ceiling, a reminder that not all silence is empty. Sometimes silence is alive, and it waits. A faint chill clung to the hallway, as if the old walls were exhaling decades of hidden secrets. The fluorescent lights above me sputtered and flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to lunge forward and then recoil from the very first moment I stepped onto the worn carpet. It felt the weight of that place pressing in on me subtly yet insistent, like a whisper against my ear that I couldn't quite decipher. I was there for a professional congress, a week of lectures, panels, and networking in a city rich with history since most of the modern accommodations were booked. I had to settle for a room in a historic hotel downtown. The photos online had shown grandiose hallways, elegant chandeliers, and a charming vintage atmosphere, yet upon my late arrival, their reality felt far less welcoming. There was a musty smell I couldn't ignore, and the staff at reception seemed one get their eyes darting nervously as they handed me my key. They mentioned that the building had been renovated multiple times over the years. The renovation, however, must have been uneven, because as I rode the outdated elevator to the fourth floor, the overhead lights dimmed and stuttered, sending my own reflection in the mirrored walls quivering and distorting the corridor. Outside, my room felt like it was from a different era. The carpet, on serich burgundy, had faded into something closer to a dull muddy maroon. The wallpaper, an ornate floral pattern, had yellowed and peaked in the corners, revealing patches of old plaster behind. Everything smelled faintly of stale air and ancient wood polish, and each step it took made a muffled creak beneath meat that our new Nilsa seemed to be around. I sensed the presence of something intangible, like the memory of countless footsteps. Crossing that same corridor over the decades, my room itself was quiet enough, albeit small and worn out. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, even if the wooden frames quaked. When I shifted my weight, a single heavily draped window overlooked the historic center. Below, the city lights outside were dim, leaving the narrow streets blanketed in darkness, despite the building's old-fashioned ambiance. I tried to reassure myself it was just a place to sleep for a few days. That first night I slept more soundly than I expected. Exhaustion from the travel and the day's events had knocked me out almost immediately. However, the second night proved different. In the early hours of the morning, I woke up suddenly with an unquenchable thirst. My mouth was bone dry, and even swallowing felt uncomfortable. I recalled spotting a vending machine in the corridor earlier, so I decided to venture outside. The hallway was dimly one out of every three lights seemed to be functional at that hour. An oppressive silence hung in the air, broken by the slow hum of the overhead fixtures. I stepped into the corridor and hesitated. At the far end, barely illuminated by a flickering bulb, stood someone wearing a dark overcoat. He was facing one of the doors, his head slightly tilted, as though listening for something. The silhouette looked almost statuesque. Unmoving, my heart gave a sudden jolt, and for a moment my breath caught in my throat. It was strange to see another guest lingering there, irresolute. It tried to rationalize that he might be returning to his room or searching for his key, but the longer he stood motionless, the more unsettled I became. I cleared my throat and took a step forward, softly calling out. The figure responded by slowly turning its head, but the corridor lighting was so poor that I couldn't clearly see any features, only a vague blur where a face should have been. My pulse, pressure in my chest building with every second. He then turned more fully and began to walk toward the far corner. There was an odd stiffness to his movements, almost like a puppet on strings, each step rigid and overly deliberate. I felt compelled to follow, partly out of curiosity and partly from a strange sense of responsibility. It was as though I needed to confirm that he was truly there, to prove to myself I hadn't just imagined the presence. My footsteps grew heavier as I approached that same corner, and my nerves prickled at the back of my neck. My breathing quickened, and I realized my hands were trembling as lick film of sweat forming on my palms. When I reached the turn, I found only a blank wall, no staircase, no door. Now where he could have gone, my heart thudded against my ribs as I searched for any hidden passage or trick of the light, but the wall was solid and uninterrupted. The wallpaper faded, but intact. I tried to steady myself, inhaling slowly. Perhaps it was a trick of exhaustion. Maybe I had seen a shadow or the shape of some furniture, or even my eyes had played a trick on me. After all, it was late, and my body was still craving rest. Convincing myself that my mind had conjured the figure, I hurried to the vending machine, grabbed a water bottle, and returned to my room. Though I felt a gnawing unease with every step it took once inside, I locked the door, turned on every lamp, and sat at the edge of my bed, sipping water. My muscles were tense, and it took ages for me to calm my racing thoughts enough to drift back to sleep. The next morning I mentioned the previous night's occurrence to a colleague from the Congress, though I didn't give many details. I only said there was something strange about that hallway. He seemed dismissive, but offered a few words of encouragement, implying old buildings often stir the imagination. It tried to leave it at that, hoping I'd be able to forget my and enjoy the rest of my stay without further incident. Yet the following evening, the hotel's atmosphere felt the heavier. The staff at the reception counter glanced up at me with apprehension, as though worried I might complain about something, but I kept my lips pressed shut. After a full day of lectures, I was exhausted again, hoping for some restorative sleep, but the moment I stepped off the elevator, I heard a faint tapping sound in the corridor. It seemed random, quiet taps separated by uneven intervals, like someone gently knocking on a wall. Unnerved, I walked slowly toward my room, straining my ears to figure out where the sound was coming from. The corridor's lighting was still dim, and the patches of darkness felt deeper than before. My heart rate accelerated when I noticed a subtle movement at the edge of my field of vision. It turned swiftly only to find an empty corridor behind. But the air felt suffocating, like it was charged with an invisible energy. By the time I reached my door, the tapping had grown faster, more urgent. A fumble with the key, my breath catching the sound, now seemed to come from multiple directions. At once, the moment I stepped inside my room, the tapping ceased abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it made my ears ring. I locked the door and leaned against it, forcing myself to take slow, measured breath. My skin prickled with a feeling of being watched. An event noon was there. I couldn't shake the sense that something had followed me throughout the night. I kept waking up each time. I felt certain I heard a faint rustling outside the door, like fabric brushing against the walls. My heart pounded so fiercely it felt like it would burst. My mouth went dry again, and beads of cold sweat formed on my forehead. When I finally dozed off, my sleep was restless and punctuated by half-formed nightmares. In those dreams, I was wandering endless corridors that looped back on themselves, with corners that revealed only more corners the next day. I confided in the hotel's front desk clerks, quietly so as not to attract too much attention. I mentioned strange occurrences and asked if there were any known issues with the hallway, or if someone else had experienced odd sightings. The clerk's eyes flicked to the manager before offering a polite but vague response. The manager, standing just behind him, gave me an uneasy smile, saying something about the building's age, and how old pipes can cause unusual noises. They seemed keen to avoid any deeper discussion. Their collective discomfort only fueled my paranoia. That same day, after the Congress sessions, returned to my room earlier than usual, determined to prove to myself there was nothing truly supernatural at play. I spent a few minutes examining the corridor in daylight, thought the windows at each end LED in minimal sunlight. The long hallway stretched out in two directions, with the main elevator on one side and a locked metal door, labeled maintenance, on the other. The corner where I had seen the stranger was an unremarkable turned, with just a small fire extinguisher on the wall. No door, no stairs. Yet as I stood there, I felt a faint draft of cool air pass by, as though something intangible had made my entire body tensed. Then a chill ran up my spine. I retreated to my room, telling myself I was letting my imagination get the better of meth that night, however, would not allow me such easy comforts. I settled into bed, dearly leaving a small table lamp on the soft glow, painted warped shadows on the walls, but it gave me thread of reassurance. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat reminding meth that I was still. Hours passed without incident, and I began to drift into a light sleep, my eyelids sheavy, my body finally succumbing to exhaustion. Then, close to midnight, I was ripped from slumber by a sharp rattle at my doorknob. My entire body froze, and my heart hammered against my ribs so violently it felt painful. The knob jiggled again, and I imagined someone, maybe that figure from the hallway, trying to get. My first instinct was to call out, but my throat was too dry. My breath caught in my lungs. I crept closer to the door, pressing my ear against it. There was a soft shuffle on the other side, then sighed. Moments later, the jiggling returned with more force. I staggered back, adrenaline surging through me, cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. The door groaned, and I felt the weight of someone or something pressing against the taste, if testing its resistance. My mind raced. Was it an intruder? Or worse, was it that faceless figure? When it finally stopped, the door knob turned slowly back into place. My knees felt weak, and I had to steady myself against the dresser. I reached for my phone and hovered over the thought of calling the front desk, but a part of me was terrified of the hotel staff's response. Terrified they might dismiss me again, or that they might suspect I was losing my mind. For several long minutes, I listened. The corridor outside was silent. I mustered the courage to peer through the peephole. The hallway was too dim to see anything but vague shapes and shadows. Noon appeared to be there. My stomach churned with dread, and I found myself questioning my own perception. Cruel tricks. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every minute seemed to stretch on indefinitely, every small creak of the old building magnified into a potential threat. My mind conjured images of that blurred face, those rigid movements, the corners that led nowhere. I felt trapped in a slow building nightmare, one that I couldn't simply wake up from because I was already awake in the morning. My nerves were frayed. I attended the last day of the Congress in a unable to focus on the speakers or discussions. I drank coffee, trying to save off the fatigue and keep my mind sharp. But every shadow, every reflection in a window, every fleeting movement at the edge of my vision jangled my nerves. People commented that I looked pale, that I seemed distracted. I muttered half-hearted explanations about stress or of sleep, too embarrassed to share my bizarre experiences. By the time I returned to the hotel that evening, I had resolved to check out early. I didn't care about any financial penalties. My only goal was to get away from that oppressive atmosphere. My chest tightened as I walked through the lobby. The staff gave me polite nods, perhaps suspecting nothing, or perhaps they knew more than they let, and I went upstairs to pack, determined to leave as soon as possible. But as I reached the fourth floor, my heart sank. The corridor lights flickered violently, plunging the hallway into a strobe-like effect. The corners and doors seemed to warp-hint the pulsing light, as thought the entire space were breathing. Then at the far end, I glimpsed the same figure in the dark, overcoat standing perfectly still facing the wall. Terrors wept over me, freezing me. In place, my breathing became shallow, my chest constricted. The figure turned slowly in that strange, deliberate motion. Its face was still an indistinct blur, but there was a suggestion of features shifting beneath the haze. I couldn't move my limbs, felt paralyzed by raw fear. My vision narrowed, and the corridor felt impossibly long, as though I would never reach my door. Then in one swift, heart-pounding moment, the light stabilized. The figure was gone, leaving the hallway empty except for the faint hum of electricity. My body was shaking, and every muscle burned with adrenaline. For a long time I stood there, unsure whether I had truly seen something, or whether my exhausted mind had fabricated it, summoning all the courage I had left. I dashed toward my room, entered, and slammed the door shut. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my heartbeat thundered in my ears. I packed my things as quickly as I could, hands trembling so badly I could barely zip up my suitcase. The walls seemed to close in on me as if the building itself resented my presence. I flung the door open, luggage in hand, and hurried to the elevator. I stabbed the button repeatedly, entire body tense. A second scrawled by like hours. Then, with a dull chime, the door slid open inside the elevator. The mirror reflected my own tormented expression back at me, face pale, lazy ghost eyes wide with dread. When the elevator reached the lobby, I found a resolute calm that replaced my panicast. Though I had crossed some threshold of terror into pure survival mode, I handed my key to the front desk clerk, who looked surprised that I was leaving early without elaborating. I checked out, ignoring the questions about whether everything was all right, stepping out onto the sidewalk. I felt the cool night air was hovering, cleansing me of that suffocating dread. My heart continued to pound, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting that dark figure to emerge from the hotel's revolving door. Yet noon followed me, even in the taxi ride to a different hotel. My mind raced through every chilling moment. It felt no relief, only a lingering sense that some part of me had brushed against the inexplicable. It tried to rationalize an old building, poor lighting, stress from the Congress, but deep down I knew there was more to it than that. Sometimes late at night, I replay the events in my mind, searching for logic in the illogical, and every time I returned to that corridor, to that corner, where there was only a wall, to that face that never truly emerged from the shadows. Perhaps it was a mere trick of perception, or perhaps there really was something lurking. In those old halls I escaped without harm, yet I can't banish the uneasy feeling that a part of me never truly left that place long after I've moved on. Till wake in the small hours of the night, half convinced that I'll open my eyes to see that figure in the doorway, silently watching, reminding me that some doors once opened can never be closed. I remember the night I arrived at the cabin, as if it were etched into my mind with a razor thin. Felt the aviarth and a denny right to be suffocating in its stillness. My first steps inside kicked up a swirl of dust from the warped floor. The door closed behind me with a dull thud that echoed too long in the cramped entryway. Even before switching on the lights, a sense of unease seeped into me stomach. This was supposed to be my sanctuary from deadlines and incessant city noise, yet all I felt was an oppressive silence pressing against my ears. I had chosen this place after scoring listings for a spot sore moat. It practically dared me to get any distraction, but writing done with a looming deadline for an article I'd been procrastinating on. I believed isolation would force my focus. I packed only the essentials, say few notebooks, my old laptop, and some clothes. There was no internet or cell phone signal here. Just the promise of tree silence and time. I'd been told the cabin basis electricity and running water. That was all I needed, at least in the Ori. When I finally flicked on the single overhead bulb, the cabin's modest interior revealed itself in an anemic glow. There was a small kitchen area in one corner, a rickety wooden table with 2 chairs near the fireplace, and a narrow hallway leading to Atney bedroom. Everything smelled faintly of mildew and old varnish. My eyes took a moment to adjust to the dim light. As I set down my bag, that was when I noticed a narrow door near the kitchen, probably a basement or root cellar. I decided to have a look right away, hoping it might hold some extra blankets or something useful. The door creaked on rusted hinges, releasing a stale odor that prickled my nose. Descending into the basement, I felt a chill emanating from the cement walls. My flashlight revealed dusty shelves with old jars, tools, and boxes I assumed Noon had touched for years. In one corner, I spotted what looked like an antique shortwave radio. The kind you might see in a collector's shop, its metal knob shed a dull sheen and the speaker cloth was torn in one corner on a whim. I carried it upstairs, figuring it might be interesting background noise if I could get it working. I had another link to the outside world, so even scratchy, regional stations would be preferable to total silence by the time. I finished lugging my suitcase into the bedroom. The overhead light was flickering slightly, as thought the cabin's wiring wasn't strong enough to handle sustained use. I was already uneasy, my pulse felt a beat faster than usual, and my breath came out in shallow bursts whenever I considered how isolated I really was. The sight of that shortwave radio on the table provided a strange comfort, though it felt like a relic from another time, something with a history behind it. Over the next day, I settled in, spent hours trying to write, of 10 staring blankly at my laptop screen, words refusing to form. Occasionally, I'd twist the radio's dial, searching for any station that might break the monotony. Sometimes I picked up bursts of static or faint music, but never anything consistent. Early that evening, I managed to tune into what sounded like a local station playing oldies. The signal was so weak that it cut out of 10, replaced by sporadic crackling, yet the music's muffled cadence was enough to make me feel less alone. That first night, as the sky turned ink black outside, I caught my reflection in the cabin's single window. I nearly jumped. My own face looked distorted against the darkness. Heart pounding as shook off, the chill creeping along my spine. I could sense a primal part of me screaming that I was too far from civilization, too cut off from help if something went wrong. My palms felt clammy whenever I thought about the nearest neighbor a good drive away, with no phone line in the cabin to call for anything short of an emergency. But it told myself I was simply adjusting. New places can be unsettling, especially in the thick of night. These con night was when it all started. I'd left the radio on softly, hoping for some static-laden music that I could ignore as it typed. The air outside had grown colder, and a sharp wind rattled the windows every once in a while. I heard a branch scrape against the exterior walls with a hollow scratch. The radio pissed and popped, weaving in and out of incomprehensible chatter from distant frequencies. Then abruptly a strange broadcast broke through the static, a low wavering murmur that sent a surge of adrenaline racing through my veins. At first I couldn't make out actual words. It was just a deep voice layered beneath thick interference. But then it sounded like it was saying my name, my actual name, drawn out slowly in a distorted whisper. I froze, my fingers shovering over my laptop keys, the rest of my body seized by electric dread. A faint sweat broke out on my forehead and my hands started trembling. It wasn't just that the voice resembled someone calling waste, the unmistakable way I elongated the syllables as if searching for me through the static. My breath caught in my throat and my heart hammered against my ribcage. It tried to adjust the radio dial to get a clearer signal. Every tweak produced a scratchy squeal that made my teeth clench for a brief second. The voice became marginally clearer, and I could sense a certain urgency in its tone, like it was straining against the static, pressing forward from some unimaginable distance. Then just as quickly it vanished. The radio snapped back to a dull hiss, leaving behind a jarring hum that resonated through the cabin. That hum was unnerving enough that I had to switch the radio off completely. But my ears kept ringing with the remnants of that sound. It felt as though the air itself was vibrating around me. I spent the rest of that night obsessively scanning every frequency on the shortwave, growing more desperate each time I failed to find the voice again. My mind buzzed with questions. Had I imagined death at a dof at my laptop, dreaming at all? But I was so alert, so keyed up from fear, that sleep felt impossible. I could almost sense eyes on me, though I knew there was noone else in the cabin. Every sooften, I'd catch myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see a shadow lurking there. My heart rate refused to slow, and my breathing stayed fast and shallow by the early hours of morning. I was physically shaking from fatigue and from an irrational dread that someone or something was trying to reach me the next day. I combed through every inch of the frequencies again, praying I'd discover a rational explanation. Perhaps it was a trick of the mind or an odd skip in the radio waves. But nothing resembling that deep whisper surfaced. The sky was gray all day, casting a leaden light through the windows that made the interior of the cabin feel claustrophobic. Every floorboard creak set me one, and I found myself jumping at the sound of my own footsteps. My paranoia took holding, tensifying each time. Imagined that voice calling out to me again. By late afternoon, a soft drizzle began tapping on the roof, and the temperature inside dipped to an uncomfortable chill. I decided to warm myself with a small fire in the fireplace, but something about gathering the old kindling from the porch made my neck prickly. Sense of being watched tugged at me. I kept spinning around, expecting to see someone just behind, even though no figure or shape appeared in my line of sight. The damp breeze rustled the pines, and I heard an eerie whistling through the branches. My stomach twisted with the certainty that something was off. Like the entire forest was too quiet waiting that night. I resisted turning on the radio. The memory of that voice had me shaken. and I doubted I'd find it again anyway. Instead, it tried focusing on my article, tapping away at my keyboard in a desperate attempt to bury my fear in work. But each paragraph forced my mind constantly drifting to previous night's encounter, then out of nowhere. I heard a distinct click from across the room and the radio turned on by itself. My blood went cold. I stared, half disbelieving. A static crackled softly in the still air. My pulse pounded in my ears so loudly I thought the cabin might echo with it. I slid my chair back, legs quivering as I moved toward the radio. I thought maybe a faulty switch or loose wire caused it to power on, but in the pit of my stomach I felt that same wave of dread. The static rose and fell, almost like breathing, until a faint voice surfaced. I couldn't make out any words this time, just a low muttering followed by high-pitched feedback that made me cringe. My hand shook so badly I could barely turn the dial. When I finally managed to switch it off, the silence that followed felt like a living entity pressing in from all sides. Convinced I was losing my mind, I paced around the cabin, glancing at every corner, as though something might emerge. A cold sweat clung to my skin, and I found myself gasping for air. Even though I wasn't moving quickly, my perception felt distorted. The walls appeared closer than they were, and the windows looked crooked and too small. Tenny relightened several times. I rubbed my eyes, hoping to refocus, but the sense of claustrophobia only grew. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard a faint scuttling from the ceiling, as if small feet were brushing across the rafters. I tried to tell myself it was just a squirrel or some woodland animal seeking shelter, but every tinny scrape felt like claws inching along my spine. My chest tightened, and I found myself pressing my hand against my heart as if to hold it in place. The air tasted metallic and bitter, fueling my suspicion that I was inhaling my own terror more than oxygen. I hardly slept when the first gray light of morning seeped into the cabin. I felt more exhausted than ever. My back ached from tension, and my head pounded with a dull itch that throbbed behind my temple. I decided I couldn't stay in that cabin another night without at least trying to ground myself in something real, so I stepped outside, letting the cool morning air brace my nerves. The forest was dense and oddly silent. No chirping birds, nor rustling wildlife, just an occasional drip from the trees after the previous night's drizzle. My stomach churned with anxiety and my breath fogged in front of me. It tried to calm my thoughts for most of that day. I avoided the radio entirely. I read through my notes for the article, forcing myself to concentrate. I even managed to write a few coherent paragraphs, though every little noise made me jump. The old refrigerator humming, the breeze rattling the window, each sound led me with jolts of pure adrenaline. By early evening, I found myself soon that my hands shook uncontrollably as it tried to drink from a water bottle. I realized then that I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. I had to confront the radio again or risk letting my imagination spiral out of control. Summoning courage, I didn't feel. I went back to the table where the radio sat silent and still. My pulse pounded painfully in my chest. I reached for the knob. My fingers were slick with sweat, making it difficult to get a firm grip. When the radio clicked on, the static that greeted me seemed subdued, like a hiss that had lost some of its intensity. I slowly turned the dials, scanning the range of frequencies, but everything was lifeless, just dull white noise and occasional whines. I was almost disappointed that I couldn't find anything at all. Part of me was hungry for an explanation, even if it frightened me. I was about to switch it off when the hum returned, a deep, resonant drone that made my skin crawl. My name reverberated in that humor, at least I thought it did. It felt like it was forming itself in the static, not quite a voice, but more like an impression of a voice. My legs threatened to buckle and cold sweat trickled down my neck. I forced myself to keep listening. My instinct screamed for me to run. And I heard something else, a phrase maybe, though it was distorted. It sounded like an urgent plea or a warning. My mind scrambled to decipher it, but I only caught disjointed syllables. A wave of lurched in my stomach. I snapped off the radio, breathing in ragged gasps. My own fear seemed so palpable in that moment that I felt suffocated. Was this some supernatural force reaching out, or was I unraveling under the stress of isolation and an impending deadline? My mind teetered between rationalizing the experience and succumbing to the terror. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to stop the spinning feeling in my head. In that darkness behind my eyelids, I heard the voice again, faint and echoing. My chest tightened as I realized it was burned into my mind, a phantom. I couldn't escape, unable to stand it any longer. I decided to leave the cabin that night. I packed my belongings in a frenzy, nearly able ledge. In my haste, the overhead light flickered wildly, sending the walls into maddening shadows. My breath rasped in my throat, and I could feel every thud of my pulse in my skull. Then the act of zipping my suitcase felt oddly laborious, as though unseen hands were tugging it away from. A part of me wondered if I'd find the radio spontaneously turned on again. But each time I looked over, it remained dark. The drive away from the cabin was nerve-wracking. The narrow dirt road seemed to blur at the edges of my vision, and every bump jolted my exhausted body. My hands Gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I glanced in the rear-view mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see something behind me, the forest pressed in an unlit corridor that swallowed my headlights. It felt like hours before. I finally made it to the main highway, heart pounding severely. I could taste the bitterness of my own fear in my mouth in the days that followed. It tried to explain. To myself, it told friends it was just my imagination running wild in an old cab with an ancient radio that picked up weird signals, but whenever I closed my eyes, I relived those pulses of dread. I still felt the sensation of being watched and heard, that disembodied voice calling my name. Through the static, my mind kept returning to moments of scanning the dial, searching for a rational explanation, and finding none. No matter how many times I dismiss it as a fluke or an overactive imagination, the memory reef refuses to evade us, sometimes in the quiet hours of the night. I'll recall that ragged human, feel my chest tighten with anxiety. The question that gnaws at me is whether it truly escaped whatever was trying to reach me then. Now I wonder if that presence might follow me through any static-laden radio wave, whispering across the ether. I wonder if I only fled the cabin physically, leaving some part of my sanity behind, to linger with that old unpredictable radio and that lingering. Doubty's a terror in its own right, haunting me long after I've locked my door, turned off every light, and tried in vain to fall asleep in the comfort of my own home. Because no matter how safe, it right to feel every his soft static on a lonely night, brings me back to that cabin, that flickering light, and that voice on the edge of hearing, always just beyond my reach, yet close enough to make my heart pound thunder in my chest. And as much as I yearn to dismiss the entire experience, I can't ignore the fear that it wasn't a dream at all. It was real somewhere out there. That distant, crackling signal might still be calling my name, waiting for me to tune in once more. I sensed the dread before I even knew what it was. The late afternoon sun, though warm and golden, seemed unable to penetrate the thickening air around me. My lungs felt tight as though I were already inhaling smoke, yet there was no reason, at least not yet, to think anything was burning. I pedaled faster, hoping the oppressive sensation would lift if I just kept moving. Instead, the heaviness settled deeper in my chest, and an uneasy prickle in my scalp warned that I was cycling into territory best left alone. I had been on a mountain biking adventure that day, traversing narrow dirt paths through old farmland. An abandoned ranch house, the trails were rarely traveled, and I enjoyed the isolation until something shifted in the atmosphere. As I ventured farther, the vegetation along the path appeared more lifeless than usual. The colors muted under a dull haze. Even the sky overhead seemed oddly subdued. A Saphathan film had blanketed the clouds. My legs kept pumping, but a sharp unease danced across my skin, approaching a particularly desolate stretch of land. He saw a cluster of collapsing structures in the distance. Rusted barbed wire fences formed a crooked perimeter around a few storage sheds, a battered silo, and what looked like an old barn. I couldn't detect any signs of life. No vehicles, no footprints, not indicating recent activity, yet an insistent adorsinged air, but not exactly. Wood smoke scratched at my nostrils. It reminded me of scorched metal, or perhaps hot stones after a campfire, something unnatural. I rolled to Astapan, dismounted carefully, hearing the gravel crunch under my tires. I scanned the area. The wind was stagnant. Dry weeds and tufts of dead grass stood still as tombstones. Turning my head, I noticed that thin line of smoke rising behind the barns of ain't that at first suspected it might just be heat shimmer, but as it narrowed my eyes, I realized it definitely had the milky gray hue of smoke. Slowly, as if hypnotized, I leaned my bike against a skeletal fence post and walked toward the barn with uncertain, deliberate steps. The closer I got, the more I felt that prickling in my scalp intensify. My heart pounded each beat, echoing in my ears. My breath grew shallow and my lips felt papery and dry. The barn's fade-red paint was peeling away in broad curls, revealing dark rot. Wood beneath gaps in the walls suffered glimpses of the interior, but all I discerned was shadow and a few hanging cobwebs. Yet behind those warped slats, a flicker of orange flashed like embers in a dying fire. There was no crackling of burning wood, no smell of charred timber, nothing to suggest an ordinary fire. The silence was intense enough that my own breathing sounded like a thunderstorm inside my skull. My fingers were starting to tremble, so I clenched them. I reminded myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe there was an old fire pit behind the barn left smoldering by some trespasser. Still, it seemed bizarre that anyone would set up a campfire here in the middle of nowhere. I circled around, trying to get a better vantage through a large gap near the barn door. The smoke appeared to fade away as though swallowed by the stale air. I couldn't figure it out. Nothing about it made sense. One moment it was clearly visible, and the next it dissolved. I rubbed my eyes in disbelief, half convinced that the heavy atmosphere was playing tricks on my vision. The tension in my shoulders tightened and my skin felt clammy with a sudden cold sweat. Despite the warmth of the day, a chill ran along my spine. I resolved to investigate, force myself to move. I reached the barn's entrance and pushed against the large sliding door. It groaned on rusty rollers, dust drifting down in a silent, suffocating cloud. My heart thudded faster as I stepped inside, fighting the impulse to turn and run. The interior was murky, illuminated only by the cracks in the walls and a few stray sunbeams that managed to slip through the broken roof. Layers of cobwebs glistened like tattered curtains. The smell was musty, moldy straw mixed with something else, something accurate and vaguely electric. I expected heat, at least a lingering warmth if there had been a fire only seconds earlier, yet the barn felt distinctly cold, as if the walls exhaled a frigid breath. My footsteps stirred a fine dust that glowed in the light, forming whirling patterns in the air. I peered around, scanning the corners. Rotting hay bales slumped against the walls, and a few old tools lay scattered on a collapsed workbench. There was no sign of flames or embers, no smoke, nothing that could have caused the glow I'd witnessed from outside, nerves jangling. I decided to explore the far side of the barn, where I'd seen the flicker. My legs felt the avy as though wading through wasted deep water. Each step kicked my pulse a notch higher. A persistent sense of being watched tugged at me. The weight of that invisible gaze made the back of my neck prickle. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd find someone lurking behind me. But the emptiness was absolute. Stillness. I heard faint sounds I couldn't quite place, like distant scratching or soft shuffling, too subtle to pinpoint. My mind raced, conjuring images of rodents or maybe just stray debris blowing across the floor. It could have been perfectly normal, it told myself. Yet the goosebumps rising on my arms argued otherwise. My throat felt uncomfortably tight as I reached the spot where the barn wall had shown that orange glow. I found nothing but a few charred boards near the ground, possibly the aftermath of a long-ago lightning strike or a failed attempt at arson. When I prodded them with my foot, the planks crumbled into black flakes, leaving no fresh heat or sign of recent fire. A bizarre question pounded in my head: how did the smoke simply vanish? I paused to steady my breathing, wiping sweat from my brow, the dust caking my face. Felt gritty, my heartbeat thundered, and my mouth was saw-dry. I could barely swallow, trying to calm myself. I recalled a conversation with a colleague. He once mentioned that illusions can manifest in moments of high stress or dehydration. Maybe I was overexerted from the beaking and imagining this entire phenomenon, but the memory of that acrid scent lingered stubbornly in my nostrils, and the image of swirling gray smoke remained vivid in my mind. Warily, I made my way back toward the barn entrance. The air outside had been stale, but inside it felt alive with tension, as though every molecule pressed against me with malevolent intent. My ears picked up an odd scraping sound, like metal against concrete, though as on an object that could produce such a noise. I froze, a scanning gloom. A shape flitted in the corner of my eye. Just a shadow or a trick of limited light. My heart hammered as I spun around, convinced someone was standing behind a pile of old crates, yet I found none. My arms trembled with a mixture of dread and adrenaline. I remembered telling myself earlier not to go inside places like this alone, especially when the atmosphere felt wrong, but curiosity had gotten the better of me. Senses on high alert, I edged along the wall, stepping over piles of splintered wood and avoiding cobwebs draping from the rafters. Each breath was shallow and ragged, as a strain to catch any hint of movement or presence. The silence itself felt like a living thing, pushing against my eardrums until they chi. At last I returned to the barn's entrance. Daylight glared in from outside, momentarily blinding me. I peered past the open door. My bike was still there, leaning against the fence post, and for a split second, I felt an overwhelming urge to sprint toward it, jump on and pedal away without looking back. Yet my curiosity wouldn't fully release me. I glanced around one last time, hoping to rationalize what had happened. Suddenly, I noticed something unusual. The dust in the air near the barn's threshold seemed to move in a slow swirl, as if caught in an ancient vortex. There was no breeze to explain it, and I was standing still. My pulse pounded in my eardrums. The swirl intensified, forming a ghostly pattern. Then in an instant it collapsed on itself, leaving me eerily still. I stepped outside, gasping as the tension in my chest momentarily lifted, only to be replaced by renewed uncertainty. Standing in the daylight should have felt reassuring, but the sky now seemed unnaturally bright, washed out like an overexposed photograph. I found myself blinking repeatedly, my vision dancing with tiny spots of color. The farmland around me was silent, no birds, no insects buzzing, no rustle of grass. I recalled hearing that sometimes right before a natural disaster animals go quiet. The ideas at my nerves again, but there was no obvious calamity here, just a deserted barn, and the faint stench of something burned without warning. A jolt of fear shot through me. I realized how alone it truly was. Nearest civilization was miles away. My phone had no signal in this remote area. I checked earlier. The barn loomed behind me like a hungry man. I half expected to see the smoker emerge from somewhere near its foundation. Instead, I caught a glimpse of motion in my peripheral vision. It was too quick, gonna soon. As it turned my head, my stomach tightened and a clammy sweat broke out across my neck. Desperate to convince myself everything was normal, I walked around the barn on more times, scanning the broken windows and battered walls for any sign of an actual fire. Nothing. The odor, that accurate electric tank, still clung to the air, though it was fainter now. My breathing remained shallow, and I kept swallowing to moisten my parched throat. My instincts shouted for me to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to reveal itself. It tried to recall if I had passed any streams or wells along my route, suspecting dehydration was partly to blame for my state of mind. Yet even if I were dehydrated, that wouldn't account for the charred boards or the swirling smoke. My heart kept drumming with an unrelenting fury. An odd sense of being tested or toyed with formed in my mind. It felt as though some presence was orchestrating these events, pushing me to confront something I'd rather avoid. Eventually, I made the decision to depart. My hands shook as I lifted my bike from its resting place. That sense of a watchful entity never left me. The barn stood behind my back, its rotting timbers somehow exuding a palpable malice. Mounting the bike, I pedal away, fighting the urge to glance over my shoulder. My muscles ached from tension, and the dryness in my throat had become a raw, burning sensation. Not far down the dirt trail, I heard what sounded like a low, distant moan. Not quite the wind, not quite an animal. The noise vibrated at a frequency that resonated in my bones, sending a fresh cascade of cold sweat down my arms. I quickened my pace, determined to get as much distance between me and that wretched place as possible. The farmland rolled by one other side, but the oppressive quality of the air lingered, as though I carried it with me like a malevolent cloud. About half a mile later, I stopped to catch my breath. My head spun and my stomach churned uneasily. I forced myself to take big gulps of water from the bottle on my bike frame, ignoring the warm plastic tasties. I rested. I recalled a friend once describing how some locations absorbed the energy of whatever horrors occurred there. I had brushed off his tale at the time now. However, I couldn't help but suspect that barn was one such place, steeped in dread, exhaling malevolence with each rotten board. As I resumed pedaling, I realized the farmland behind me was unnaturally silent. Even as I moved farther away, a persistent image filled my mind's eye, that subtle swirl of dust near the barn door. Twisting like a living entity, my heart refused to calm, each beat still hammering against my rib cage. My body was slick with sweat and my legs felt like trembling rubber. I tried focusing on the crunch of the dirt under my tires to ground myself in the moment, but the memory of that flickering orange glow and the ghostly smoke clung to me, refusing to fade. At one point, it turned onto a slightly larger dirt road that connected to the main route. After several minutes of biking, the air around me felt less stifling. A few insects buzzed near the weeds, and a solitary croak in the distance. Breaking the unnatural silence, the sun was sinking lower in the sky, painting the horizon in a bruised palette of purples and oranges. Despite these more mundane details, my body remained tense, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, fearful it might glimpse a column of smoke trailing after me like a curse. By the time I reached a familiar crossroads, dusk had begun to settle there. Leaf of seeing a weathered sign pointing toward a small town I knew felt like a reprieve from suffocation. Still, my mind churned with questions. What had I really seen? Was it a hallucinational, effed-over phenomenon from some old accident that lingered in the structure of the barn? Or was it something beyond rational explanation, a gateway to Ariel best left undiscovered? I never got an answer that satisfied me. Even now, recalling the incident makes my hands clammy and my pulse rises sometimes. In the quiet moments before sleep, I replay the memory of that swirl of smoke behind the barn, followed by its abrupt disappearance. I recall the sensation of something watching, measuring me in that darkness. No matter how many times I try to rationalize it, the hollow dread in my gut remains. It took days for the lingering or imagined or not to fully fade from my senses, yet the psychological scar cut deeper. The barn still returns to my thoughts in flashes, typically accompanied by a sudden wave of goosebumps. On rare occasions, I'll wake from a dream drenched in sweat, with the echo of that low moan in my ears. When morning comes, I'm often left with an insidious feeling that I brought something back with me, a bit of that malevolent presence that refuses to let go. I've considered returning to that stretch of farmland to prove something to myself, to confirm once and for all whether there was a legitimate explanation, a hidden fire pitatric of light, or some phenomenon I misinterpret. Under stress, but each time I entertain the idea, an involuntary shudder seizes me, and my mouth turns as dry as dust. My heart starts and just at the possibility perhaps it's best left alone. Some places, and whatever dwells within them, don't need second chances. We cross paths with mysteries that exceed our understanding and poke holes in our sense of reality. Sometimes the wisest course is to walk, or in my case, bike away. And so I remain burdened by the memory, a mix of terror and fascination that clings like a dark stain on my soul. Though I escaped physically unscathed, the relentless question of what truly happened in that barn follows me still, even at a distance. The haunting notion that the smoke might return at any moment keeps my nerves wongy. It lurks in my mind, an unwelcome companion that reminds me there are forces in this world that defy your comfort and challenge our sanity. I don't plan on going back. Let that place slumber submerged in whatever secrets it's been hoarding. There may be no conclusive end to this story, only the restless feeling that the barn still stands waiting, and whenever I close my eyes and recall that fleeting swirl of ghostly smoke, I feel the weight of its silent stare pressing against me again, demanding my attention. For now I refuse to answer, but part of knows that the darkness in that barn has its own plans, and whether I confront it or not, it remains very much alive in the corridors of my mind. I never used to believe that the dead of night could truly belong to anything other than weary travelers and the occasional insomniac, but my conviction faltered on a deserted highway where the rain has set against my windshield like a warning, and the cold seeped into my bones there in the inky darkness, that I felt something pressing around me, something ancient, hungry for attention, and completely beyond my understanding. My heart still pounds whenever I think about those lonely hours before sunrise when the world seemed suspended between dreams and waking nightmares. I had set out from home at around 2 in the morning, hoping to avoid the weekend traffic. The night was cold, a sharp chill that felt like it snaked around my chest every time it took a breath. A faint drizzle tapped on the roof of my car, creating this almost hypnotic lull for a time. I allowed myself to believe the worst I would face was boredom and as light tension in my neck from staring too long at the scarcely lit highway. The landscape outside offered little comfort, and fields drowned in the dull glow of my headlights and an overcast ski that refused to share even a sliver of moonlight. My coffee thermos lay empty on the passenger seat, rolling around each time I navigated Agent LeCurve. Occasionally, I looked at the fuel gauge, feeling a vague unease that had nothing to do with running out of gas. There was a sense deep within me that my solitude on the road was an illusion. I had the persistent impression that something was out there, pacing just beyond the beams of my headlights, waiting it ride to refocus on the drive. Turning on the radio, static greeted me, harsh rasp that made the fine hair on my arms lift. I searched for a station, but the only one I found played an off-tempo country ball ad that sounded strangely distorted. At that hour, the singer's voice wavered, as though struggling to rise above a deep interference. The garbled sound set me one gesso. I turned the radio off. Silence took over, interspersed with the relentless pitter-patter of raindrops and my own heartbeat pushing into my ears. Soon a restlessness settled over me. My limbs felt cramped. My eyes wanted a break from the darkness. The overhead sign promised another rest up in a few miles, but something compelled me to pull over sooner. The road ahead was empty, not a single pair of headlights approaching in either direction. My foot eased off the accelerator, and I coasted onto the shoulder, the umble strip vibrating beneath my tires. I parked and turned on my hazard lights, trying to quell the jitters crawling across my skin. Stepping out of the car, I was immediately struck by how cold the drizzle felt against my skin. The air smelled of wet asphalt and distant pine. I took a swig of water from a bottle, the liquid practically freezing on my tongue, then stretched my arms overhead. My breath came out shallow puffs as I did a quick check around to ensure I wouldn't be in any danger from passing vehicles, though I had seen none for miles. The darkness was palpable, thick enough that I had to rely on the faint glow of my taillights to orient myself. That was when I noticed a figure. It was a solitary shape, perched on the low embankment by the side of the road, only a few yards away. My first instinct was to recoil, because I was certain I had parked in an empty stretch of highway. This person, from what I could discern, appeared to be sitting with slumped shoulders, head bowed as though exhausted. Oral. The silhouette was so that at first I thought it of the weak light, yet the longer I looked, the more details I could make out. A man, possibly wearing something dark. He seemed weather-beaten and weighed down by something intangible. My pulse instantly kicked up, but a sense of responsibility also rose within me. It took a few steps closer to the shoulder, making sure I wasn't intruding on a dangerous situation. The drizzle intensified, sheets of raindrops now shimmering under my hazard lights. I found myself raising my voice to ask if he needed help. The words sounded strange in here, my own ears carried away by the hiss of rain and the rumble of distant thunder. When I spoke, he stirred slowly, arose from his spot. The motion seemed laborious as every joint in his body resisted. For an instant, I glimpsed his outline more clearly. Shoulder hunched, arms hanging limp at his side. She wavered on unsteady legs, then turned away, slipping behind a large metal sign that signaled the upcoming rest stop. Alarm bells rang in my head. Maybe he was wary of strangers, or perhaps he was experiencing some sort of episode. I remembered my trunk had a spare blanket and some food supplies, so thought maybe I could offer him something warm. Adrenaline pushed me forward, and I found myself following his path. Yet by the time I reached the sign, no more than a breath or two after he disappeared behind it, the rue was noon. There I called out again, this time trying to convey more empathy in my tone, but the wind answered with a hollow moan. Rain pelted my jacket rivulet streaming down my face. My flashlight, retrieved from the cars, sliced through the darkness to reveal nothing but flattened grass and gravel. There were no footprints, no sign that someone had been sitting there or moving about. I felt an immediate chill trickle down my spine, my lungs, drew in a shaky breath, and scanned the surroundings with renewed urgency. The highway stretched away in either direction, a ribbon of black tar litany. The road, or stumbling across the open field. But I was alone. A wave of knees washed over me and my body reacted, heart-hammering, palms slick with sweat despite the cold, a tremor building in my legs. It was a primal response, a reminiscent of the fear that creeps in when you sense a predator at your back. It made one last attempt to search the area, stepping onto the wet grass with hesitant feet. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the crackle of the rain. Every sense was on high alert. Convinced it might see that hunched figure again, silently watching from the darkness, unable to shake the feeling that I was no longer safe. I retreated to my cart. The moment Islam met the door, I exhaled a sigh of mingled relief and dread. My headlights cut through the rain-swept night, and for an irrational moment, I pictured that figure standing just beyond the glow, eyes fixed on me. Tightened the car. Fact remained, I had seen something or someone in the darkness. I forced myself to get back on the road, telling myself that I reached the next Tristeria, I'd go inside, maybe talk to an attendant if a present, and clear my head. As I drove, every sign that loomed out of the darkness looked suspiciously like the sign where the figure had disappeared. It tried to convince myself it was just the angle of my headlights playing tricks, but each time a little knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see a shape pop into view on the back seat or outside, and the swirling, gloomy grip on the steering wheel was so tight that my knuckles began to oach. The drizzle grew heavier. It tried the source of turning the wipers off briefly, but the tapping persisted, a random staccato that made me grit my teeth. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat echoing in my ears. I felt certain something was trying to breach the thin barrier of glass and metal that separated me from the endless void outside after what felt like an eternity. As all the lights of the rest stopped, I pulled into the parking lot, off expecting it to be deserted, but there was a lone sedan parked next to a lamppost. The harsh fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting flickering shadows on the wet asphalt. I decided to go inside and rinse my face, gather my nerves. The lobby was dull and unwelcoming, with a few vending machines humming in a corner. An attendant, a middle-aged man wearing a bored expression, seated behind a service counter, humorly glanced at, then returned to fiddling with something behind the desk. I didn't speak directly to him. Instead, I headed to the restroom to wash my hands and try to convince myself that I was simply overreacting in the mirror. I noticed how pale I looked, dark circles under my eyes. My hair was damp and clung to my forehead. My lips were nearly bloodless, a sign of the stress thrumming through my veins. I splashed cold water on my face, noticing the goosebumps on my arms while I was in there. I had the distinct impression that the rest stop was emptier than it should have been, even for such an odd hour. There was a hush and almost oppressive silence, broken only by the buzzing off fluorescent lights and the mechanical groan of a soda machine outside. When I emerged, the attendant was gone, leaving the place feeling even more unsettling. I wondered if maybe he had stepped outside, but the front doors were closed, and the swirling rain made it unlikely he'd choose to stand in the downpour. I left quickly. Prefer familiarity of my car. I checked the stand again. It was still the rebut. No sign of the driver. As I pulled onto the highway, a jolt of adrenaline coursed through me. For a split second, in the edge of my peripheral vision, I thought I saw someone sitting in my back seat. I whipped my head around, almost veering off the road. The seat was empty. My heart battered my chest, each throb resonating in my temples. I muttered under my breath that it was just a hallucination. The tension in my body refused to subside, and I sensed I was being watched again. The mile seemed longer now. The road, an unspooling corridor of gloom. Rain battered my car mercilessly, and the air inside felt suffocating. It ried, cracking a window, but the cold gust that blew in made me shiver uncontrollably. The paranoia got worse. My eyes constantly flicked to the side mirrors, expecting to see that figure lurking in the breakdown. Lane, my thoughts began racing. Was I losing my mind? Had I truly seen a man by the road, or was it some reflection on the wet pavement? Every soufton, my breath caught in my throat, and I realized my hands were shaking. The Nassif signaled by the clamoring of my thoughts. The tapping returned. It was faint, at first a muffled sound that seemed to come from the car's roof. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on keeping my car centered in the lane, but it grew louder, more insistent, like knuckles rapping in a strange pattern. My blood ran cold. I felt the primal urge to slam the brakes and get out, but the idea of standing on a dark, deserted highway again, vulnerable in the pouring rain, was even more terrifying. I pushed down the accelerator, heart hammering, telling myself I'd outrun whatever was clinging to the car, if indeed anything was there. The tapping finally ceased, replaced by a slow scraping noise on the passenger side, as if fingers were sliding along the length off the window. I can't describe the chill that seeped into my very bones, the mixture of dread and bewilderment that tightened around my lungs. It forced myself not to look. A sense of unreality weighed on me. This could not be happening. My breathing became ragged, shallow gas, as my vision tunneled, and for a heartbeat I feared I would black out from sheer terror. Just when I thought I could not bear another second, I saw the outline of another roadside sign indicating an exit leading to a more populated area. Streetlights glowed faintly in the distance, promising some small measure of refuge. With every nerve wound, I veered off the highway, merging onto a ramp that led to the outskirts of a small town. The scraping noise vanished the moment the car's tires left the main road, as if some invisible presence had lost its grip under the illumination of streetlights. I finally felt that some barrier of darkness had been broken. My breath started to return to a steadier rhythm, though my heart still pounded. I parked in a brightly lit gas station where several trucks were lined up. The open canopy cast everything in a sterile white glow, washing out the color of my car. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, feeling the reality of my surroundings reassert itself. The world no longer seemed as menacing under electric lights. Rain drummed on the roof, but it was just rain now. No eerie tapping, no scraping. My mind raced over the events of the last hour. The recollections felt unreal. The slumped man by the roadside, the sign behind which he vanished, the inexplicable noises on my car, and that suffocating sensation that I was never alone. I questioned whether exhaustion had triggered some elaborate hallucination. Yet part of me resisted that explanation. The fear I had experienced was too intense, too visceral. Even as I calmed down, I couldn't entirely escape the lingering dread that something had followed me to that well-lit gas station and was just outside the ring of fluorescent light, waiting after fueling up. I stepped inside the station shop to collect myself. The bright fluorescent bulbs flickered, occasionally casting fleeting shadows across the aisles of snacks and drinks. A radio behind the counter played a static-filled broadcast. I asked the clerk in a low, tense voice if there'd been any reports of strainings on the highway. He replied vaguely, barely looking up, that sometimes folks came and rattled about odd lights or shapes, but it hadn't heard anything that night. His casual dismissal made me feel uneasy, as if my experiences were being brushed aside or reduced to mere rumor. I paid for a hot coffee and returned to my car, still trembling despite the warmth of the beverage in my hands. For a brief moment, I considered checking into a nearby motel and trying to sleep off the panic, but the lingering sense of being watched persisted. It felt safer continuing my journey under the protective glow of the small town streetlights. So eventually I merged onto another road that bypassed the empty stretches of the highway, hoping daylight would catch up. Before anything else did, the tap of rain receded into a dull background murmur, replaced by the steady hum of my engine and the swirling mania inside my head. Hours later, I finally reached my destination, physically intact, though far from at peace. Even as I parked in front of my friend's place, I refused to relax until I was safely indoors. Stepping out of the car, I glanced behind more times than I could count, convinced that a stooped silhouette might be following, but there was only the skeletal outline of trees and the hush of a neighborhood still sleeping. To this day, I replay those moments on the highway. I can't be certain whether I encountered a lost soul, a ghost, or a figment of my wary mind. What remains undeniable is the acute terror. I felt skin, clammy, chest tight, every sense firing wildly in alarm. In that desolate stretch of asphalt, it was as though I brushed against a sliver of reality that refused to fit into my rational world, even now when it rains late. Tapping on the windshield, and though I've tried to tell myself I was just sleep-deprived or anxious, I've never been able to fully shake the sensation that I was not alone out there somewhere in the wet shadows. That presence still lurks, watching, waiting, and perhaps searching for the next traveler willing to stop in the middle of the night. I remembered the oppressive stillness of that morning. As if it were etched into my bones, it clung to the air, filling every space with a muted anticipation that pressed against me and made it hard to breathe. Even before I reached my uncle's property, a secluded parcel of land far from paved roads and any sign of human life, I sensed something wasn't quite right. The wind barely stirred, and when it did, it carried a faint acrid smell I couldn't place. It tried to dismiss my unease by chalking it up to sleepiness or nerves, but deep down a primal part of me whispered warnings I couldn't Ignore was in my early 30s back then, and I'd grown wary of the same workaday routine that had characterized my life. For months, my uncle, knowing it needed a break, had offered to let me camp on the property. He looked after it was supposed to be a simple, peaceful getaway, just meat and the calming isolation of nature, so I loaded my car with the essential sastardy tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and enough flashlights to illuminate a small city. I left home at the crack of dawn, wanting to get there early and set up camp before the midday. Sun became unbearable once on the empty highway. It felt freer than I had in a long time. There was not traffic, just a ribbon of asphalt cutting through an endless stretch of countryside hills rolled by, and the occasional twisted trees stood defiant against the open sky. The sense of solitude was comforting, at least initially. But then I saw the dog. He was a medium-sized mongrel, his fur matted and strewn with dirt, standing motionless by the side. Off the road, his posture was strangely rigid, as if he were waiting for something. Our eyes locked in that instant. It felt a bizarre to recognition. His dark eyes were intense, reflecting something beyond the typical canine curiosity. Despite his ragged appearance, he wagged his tail as though greeting an old friend. His load the carcer, Tane should stop and check if he was hurt or lost. The moment I pulled to the side, he bolted one instant. The next, the head vanished into the tall grass lining the road. No barking, no growling, no sound at all. It was as if he dissolved into the earth. I sat in my car for a long minute, engine running, trying to decide whether I should go after him. My heartbeat fluttered with the strange deja vu of till eventually I convinced myself it was pointless. The dog clearly didn't want to be found. I drove on, thought the encounter left me unsettled. I reached the property by mid-morning. My uncle had told me I'd see an old wooden gate marking the entrance, but the gate looked even older and more weathered than I'd imagined. Rust corroded the hinges, and the wood was rough and splintered from the elements. There was a narrow dirt path just beyond the gate that wound through dense clusters of trees, eventually opening into a small clearing that was where I planned to pitch my tent once parked. I stepped out into the silence and felt the full grunt of isolation. Now distant fume of highways, no chatter of distant neighbors, just the hiss of the breeze through the treetops and the scrunch of gravel under my boots. I just about set up my tent when I saw him again. The same dog crouched at the edge of the clearing. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt an odd thrill of anxiety tighten my chest. He was watching me, tail still, as if deciding what to do. I tried a gentle call, just a soft, "Hey, buddy," but it was more to calm myself than to beckon him. He didn't budge, didn't bark, just stared. After a moment, he circled around to the other side of the clearing, keeping a wide gap between us. When I stepped toward him, he darted behind a large oak tree and disappeared. I felt a slight tremor in my hands as I exhaled. I've seen plenty of stray dogs before, but this one felt different. Something in his eyes made my pulse hammer. It was neither fear nor friendliness, but something else, something that made me question whether I was truly alone out there. I managed to finish setting up camp with the lingering sensation of being watched. Now and then I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the tree line, but I tried to focus on the simple tasks: rolling out my sleeping bag, organizing my supplies, double-checking I had fresh batteries for my flashlights. By the time dew settled over the clearing, the world turned quiet again, as though nature itself was holding its breath. The temperature dropped faster than I expected, and a thin layer of mist began to weave around the tree trunks, giving the ghostly outline. I built a small campfire and a piece of chicken, trying to concentrate on the sizzle and scent of cooking meat. Still, an uneasiness gnawed at my gut. My eyes kept darting around, scanning the area beyond the firelight. The dog didn't show up again while I ate, so I eventually convinced myself he was just a stray passing through. Maybe my mind was overreacting. I watched the flames dance until my eyes felt the avi. I wasn't sure what time it was when I woke. The darkness outside seemed to tall the interior of my tent, casting shadows that felt claustrophobic. My heart pounded in my ears before I fully understood why. Then I heard it, a faint rustling like paws or feet scuffing the ground outside. My throat went dry, and I strained to listen. Something circled the perimeter of my tent, slow and deliberate. The sound came and went, alternating between near silence and the soft crackle of grass being pressed under weight. It stopped for a moment, and I built the courage to peek out through a small gap in the zip. Piercing lights like tiny beacons floated in the dark. They seemed to hover in midair, flickering whenever they caught the faint reflection of the moon. My heart hammered. Those had to be the dog's eyes only. They looked far too bright, almost like reflective lenses. It froze, a torn between zipping the tent shut and stepping out to chase him away. Each thud of my pulse felt magnified, like it was booming in my skull. These cuns stretched. I thought I heard a loud huff. Then the eyes blinked once and vanished. I listened for more movement, but nothing came. The rest of the night passed in agonizing anticipation, my brain spinning all sorts of scenarios I couldn't explain. Sleep never fully returned. When dawn broke, emerged from the tent exhausted but determined the fire was long gone and the clearing looked unremarkable in the pale morning light. I walked the perimeter searching for footprints or paw prints, some evidence that the dog had really been there. The ground was mostly damp soil and grass, which should have at least shown a disturbance, but there was nothing, no indentations, no broken twigs, just unmarked earth. My hands began to shake again. I tried telling myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I dreamed the entire episode. However, the memory of those glowing eyes and the unmistakable sound of something moving around my tent was too vivid to dismiss. The day wore on quietly, almost too quietly. I roamed the property half hoping to find the dog so I could offer him water or a piece of jerky. My uncle had left a few notes about the layout of the land, including mention of an old barn and a small pond. I found them without much trouble, but no sign of the dog appeared. I kept scanning the ground for prints or fur, but it might as well have been investigating a phantom. An undercurrent of dread trailed me everywhere I went, as thought the solitude itself had taken on a malevolent consciousness. Even the birds seemed subdued, only letting out occasional, half-hearted chirp. By late afternoon, clouds gathered overhead, bringing premature darkness. I'd planned to spend a second night, but an inexplicable urgency to leave fought against my original intentions. My skin prickled whenever the wind picked up, and it seemed like every tree was leaning in my direction, branches twisted as a thin silent warning. I decided to make a quick meal before deciding whether to pack back up and go. But a persistent thought nagged at me. I had come here for peace of mind, to reconnect with myself. Letting fear drive me away felt like admitting defeat to something intangible and possibly in my imagination. Nevertheless, I couldn't ignore the sense that I was being observed. That feeling returned in force. While I gathered firewood, I kept turning around, expecting to catch a glimpse of dark furs lipping between the trees. Since I then thought I saw a shape sitting still at the far end of the pond, a silhouette that vanished the moment I blinked. My breath hitched, and I could taste metallic tango of adrenaline on my tongue. My hands were damp with sweat as I gripped the bundle of kindling, arms trembling under the weight. I had to force myself to breathe slowly. If I gave into panic, I knew I'd never recover enough courage to stay the night. Dusk arrived with a heavy gloom, the clouds swallowing any hint of starlight. The campfire crackled, casting tall shadows that danced across the clearing. Is that close to the flames, a flashlight within reach, determined to keep my eyes open until they stung with fatigue. Time felt warped, each minute stretched uncomfortably as if the night were resisting any progress toward dawn. The wind carried hushed whispers, so at least that's what my mind interpreted from the rustle of leaves. Eventually I heard faint movement in the distance. My stomach clenched and goosebumps rippled over my arms. This time the footsteps or paw steps came from behind a cluster of bushes to the left of my tent. I shone my flashlight in that direction. The slicing through the darkness, nothing. My pulse pounded louder, and I had to remind myself to breathe. I tried to calm my racing thoughts by mentally listing everything around me: the crackle of the fire, the shape of the endless stretch of blackened sky overhead. But a sudden chill skirted across my neck, though someone had blown cold air right behind me. I whipped around, standing not 5 yards away was the dog, his fur looking almost cold black in the firelight, though earlier I remembered it being a muddy brown. His eyes reflected the flames with an unsettling, gleamy. Heart lurched so violently that I nearly dropped the flashlight. He stared at me unblinking. I felt pinned under his gaze, adrenaline coursing through my veins. My throat constricted as it tried to speak calmly, but all that came out was a hoarse whisper. I thought about approaching him, but an instinct screamed not to move. The dog tilted his head slightly, as if puzzled by my presence. For a moment, I considered that maybe he was just hungry or tired, but I couldn't shake the sense of wrongness emanating from him. My entire body was tense, my breath uneven, as abruptly a sheet appeared. He turned and bolted into the darkness, disappearing from the halo of my flashlight within seconds. The undergrowth swallowed him completely, leaving no rustle or footfall behind. It was as if the night had taken him back into itself. That point, I didn't care about a second night of solitude. My nerves were shot. I began dousing the campfire and hastily gathering my belongings. My heart pounded so fiercely that I worried it might hyperventilate. While rolling up my tent, I kept casting anxious glances over my shoulder, half expecting the dog to resurface. It felt like each gust of wind carried unseen shapes closing in. My vision blurred with panic, and I could barely steady my hands enough to zip up my pack. The whole time, I was aware of my body's primal reactions, the dryness in my mouth, the cold sweat dampening my brow, trembling in my legs that made each movement jerk and stilted. Suddenly, there was a snapping sound behind me, like a branch breaking under pressure. Is spun around hard in the flashlight beam, jittering across tree trunks. Nothing was there, or at least nothing I could see. Me instinct to flee blared like as I ran in my head. I fumbled with my supplies, stuffing them haphazard into the back seat of my car. Just as he slid into the driver's seat, I thought I glimpsed a flash of two reflective dots from the corner of my eye, but I refused to look back. I jammed the key into the ignition, turned it, and pressed the accelerator with a desperation that kicked up dust in a wild, swirling cloud. Driving away felt both relieving and terrifying. The narrow dirt path leading out of the property was lined with twisted trees that seemed to lean in accusingly. My hands shook on the steering wheel, eyes darting at every shape in the darkness. I kept imagining the dog running along beside me, hidden just beyond the feeble reach of my headlights. A part of me worried I might lose control of the car if something leaped out. My mind replayed every second of the past 2 days, searching for a rational explanation and coming up empty. Perhaps the dog was just a stray, but why no footprints, and why those impossibly bright eyes in the dead of night? I didn't fully relax until I hit the highway against the hum of the asphalt under my tires, offering some sense of normalcy. Even then my muscles remained taut, my breathing still shallow. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half convinced I'd see a silhouette bounding after me. Logic in me said that was nonsense, but logic had lost its footing the moment I laid eyes on that dog. When I got home, it felt surreal to be surrounded by familiar walls and furniture. My heart rate gradually slowed, though my mind remained trapped in the echo of those events. It tried explaining it to a friend over the phone, using indirect words like strange, canine, and unsettling. They were skeptical. They casually suggested I'd had a vivid nightmare brought on by isolation and stress. They might be right. I thought, yet something in me refused to believe. It was just an overactive imagination. For weeks, I was plagued by dreams of those glowing eyes, an ever-present watcher just beyond the edge of vision. I'd wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the memory of sottings, pattings fresh in my ears. Every time I passed a stray dog on the street, I'd feel my chest tighten, afraid to look into its eyes and confirm whatever unspoken recognition I feared was there. I never found out who owned that dog, or if it was indeed a stray. My uncle claimed not to have seen any dogs around the property, assuring me it was probably a wandering animal that picked up on my scent. Maybe that was all it was, but I couldn't ignore the sense of violation, like something ancient and unknowable had brushed against my life for those 2 nights, leaving its mark. Even now I catch myself peering into shadowy corner shaft, expecting to see that dirty furor and those reflective eyes watching, waiting, judging. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that campsite. Part of me wants closure, to force a confrontation with my imagination, or whatever I encountered. But another part, the part that still jolts awake in the middle of the night, insists to stay far away. There are things in this world, whether real or conjured from the depths of our own anxiety, that defy easy explanations. Perhaps it was just a lost dog, but I'll never shake the feeling that something else waits there in those woods, wearing the shape of an animal, silently testing the boundaries of my sanity. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see those shining eyes in the darkness staring back at me, as if to say, I am here and you are never truly alone. I remember the unsettling stillness of that place before I even stepped out of the truck. The moment the engine died, the silences seemed to devour every other sound in the world. The sky was a palette gray, layered with clouds that promised rain but never delivered. The air carried a nearly autumn chill that clung to my skin like a warning. Standing on the shore of that secluded lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruders trespassing on something ancient and resentful. Me friend, let's call him Marcos, was already unloading the fishing rod, chumming under his breath in a futile attempt to lighten the mood, but I sensed he felt it too. Something in the hushed wind, in the courses, and beneath our boots whispered that we had wandered into a place that preferred to be left alone. We had arrived in the late afternoon, hoping for a tranquil Friday of fishing, away from the city noise. The sun washed hidden behind clouds, leaving the landscape steeped in a dim, colorless glow. The lake surface was almost opaque, a sheet of dark water that refused to reflect the world around it. Yet we proceeded with our plan, collecting our gear and picking out a spot near the water's edge. The only other signs of life were a couple of distant birds somewhere in the thick pines that surrounded us. Their calls sounded forlorn, as if warning us to keep our distance. My breath caught a little in my throat. When we finally settled down, the temperature was dropping, yet the dryness in my mouth intensified. My heart thumped with steady anticipation, not necessarily of excitement, but of avid dread. I couldn't name. Marcos broke the silence on to comment on how unusually quiet the place was, but I just nodded allegiance. Ishin pressed on my chest. It felt as thought the lake was watching us, waiting for night to fall. Our fishing attempts that afternoon proved uneventful. There were no strong bites, only the occasional twitch at the end of the line that turned out to be nothing. It tried to focus on the slow, methodical process of casting the liner, reeling item and casting again, but something kept my nerves wonge each time I breathed as war. I heard of a faint rustling in the tall grass behind us, or a distant gurgle from somewhere deep within the lake. When the wind blew across the water, it carried a whispering sound like a low moan echoing across the expanse. Eventually, the sun dipped below the horizon. Clouds not already swallowed it. Twilight seeped into the surroundings quickly, and with it came oppressive heaviness in the air. We set up a small campfire close to the water, hoping the flickering flames would soothe our nerves. The fire cast dancing shadows on the surface of the lake, distorted shapes that writhed and warped before vanishing into the darkness. My muscles tight, conscious of every breath, my ears strained for any sign of the normal nighttime chorus, cricket sounds, the gentle lap of water, but there was only a strange hush. While we warmed our hands by the fire, we spoke indirectly about life's recent stresses, work, relationship, all the mundane troubles Marcos mentioned. How he'd been feeling restless, as if he needed to prove something to himself, maybe by conquering our moat fishing spot. I confessed I was only there for peace, but I wasn't finding much of it. Despite our attempts at normal conversation, a thick tension stretched between our words. I felt my spine tighten each time the wind ceased, and the moment the breeze died, the air hung around us with an uncanny stillness. That was when we first heard the sound. It was around. At night, judging by the dying embers of our modest fire, at first it resembled a low groan or a heavy sigh that rose from somewhere on the lake. It was as if a slumbering creature had suddenly inhaled, straining its lungs. In the process, the hair on my arms stood done, and Marcos and I exchanged uneasy glances. There was no direct need for dialogue. The alarm was plain in our eyes. Webeth turned toward the water, but there was nothing to see, only the small ripples reflecting firelight. I told myself wind funneling through the dense trees, or maybe some large fish breaking the surface. Yet each time it tried to rationalize it, I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my temples, my breath turning shallow. The sound had an undeniably human quality, as though someone out there just beyond sight was struggling to breathe. When the wind blew again, it carried the faint of that strained inhalation, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. The noise repeated itself intermittently, especially when the breeze died down. Each time it seemed slightly louder, a bit closer, until I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from calling out. Every nerve in my body told me it was a terrible idea to call into that darkness. Instead, I sat there, pinned under a suffocating sense that something was out in the lake, inching toward you, suddenly revealing its presence through those ghastly labored exhalations. Marco stoked the fire, hoping the brighter flames might push away or unease, but the surge subtle movements near the water's surface. It was as if a hunched figure lingered at the boundary where the shore met, the lake, its silhouette melting into the gloom. Whenever the flames flickered, my muscles twitched each time. It thought as would a jolt of electric fear snapping through me. I couldn't tell if I was imagining these shapes or if something truly shifted in the darkness. Sometime later, a gust of cold wind struck me with such force that it shivered violently. My teeth chattered and my shoulders tensed up as if preparing for an attack. That was when I grabbed my flashlight. In that moment, I decided I needed to see what was really there, to banish the illusions that were taking root in my mind. Switching it on, I pointed the beam across the surface of the lake. The pale light cut through the night, illuminating only the gentle rise and fall of dark water. Noise reflected back, no creature emerged, yet the sensation of being watched intensified, and the dull itch in my stomach grew into a knot of dread. My breathing became ragged the longer I searched with the flashlight. I thought of shining it into the trees behind us, but a paralyzing fear held me back. A small part of me dreaded what I might find or what might fin me if I dared to look away from the water. Instead, it turned off the flashlight, letting the silence descend again. The moment the light disappeared, the sound returned, that wee trattling inhalation that sent my heart into a gallop. We spent the rest of the night, dozing off in short, fitful bursts, only to jolt awake when the noise crescendoed occasionally. I felt as if my own breath was in sync with that alien moan, as though something was drawing the air out of my lungs, forcing me to share its laborious respiration. Each time I closed my eyes, I imagined the lake surface parting to reveal it, twisted face, lips parted, a toothless gas sweet clung to my forehead despite the cold, and my clothes felt damp against my skin. Adding to my discomfort, my heart pounded so fiercely that it vibrated my ribs, and every shadow seemed to hide ace defies. A creeping doubt began to gnaw at my sanity. I caught myself wondering if it was all a hallucination, some manifestation of the stress I'd brought with me. Yet Marcos clearly heard the same sound, and the fact that we both experienced it lent a sinister weight to the entire night. Occasionally he would mention that maybe we should pack up and leave, but neither of us had the energy or courage to dismantle the tent in the middle of the darkness. We feared that if we turned our backs on the water, whatever lurked, we might seize the opportunity to approach more boldly. At around 4 in the morning, there was a fleeting moment of calm. The sound seemed to recede, and the wind picked up again, rustling the trees and masking any faint echoes my own breathing leveled out. Though my throat felt raw from tension, I remember hoping that the first light of dawn would dispel this nightmare, as I stared at the dying embers of our fire. If aught the overwhelming urge to run the dread was a living thing slithering through my mind and feeding one every flicker of hope. When morning finally came, it arrived in half-light, filtered through the haze of dense clouds. The relief I expected never fully materialized. Instead, I fell to numb exhaustion, my limbs trembled from fatigue and my eyes were gritty from lack of restful sleep. The lake looked less menacing in the dull morning gloomy, yet I couldn't ignore the lingering heaviness in the pit of my stomach. As we cautiously moved closer to the shore, we noticed only old animal tracks in the muddy stretch, possibly deer or some other creature, yet none of these footprints explained the horrifying human-like gasping we'd heard. My pulse quickened again. As I inspected the area, the footprints were half-faded, suggesting they'd been made days earlier. There weren't of resh marks, nothing that could account for the presence we had felt. It told Marcos that maybe the lake had some bizarre acoustic phenomenon. Or maybe we had spooked ourselves into hearing things, but as I said it, my voice wavered and my mouth tasted bitter. I knew deep down that we had experienced something real, something that transcended a simple trick of the wind or choice. The Valley West started packing up her gear. Every small sound amplified by our frayed nerves. My heart raced at the snap of a twig and my head whipped around. Each time imagined a shape at the edge of my vision, the more it tried to maintain calm. The more my hands trembled, my skin felt clammy and a faint buzzing filled my ears. Even mundane tasks, coiling fishing lines, zipping up the tent, took on a tense urgency. It was as though we were being watched, and then like the lake itself might lash out if we stayed a moment too long as loaded the truck. I became acutely aware of how the entire environment seemed to hold its breath. The sky hung low with thick clouds. The water was unnaturally still and the wind had settled again, and into a hushed mind flashback to the night's haunting refrain. I half expected that awful rattling sight of load up from the lake, one more time demanding acknowledgement, but it never came. That silence unsettled me even more, leaving a hollow ache in my chest. The sense of a looming presence remained, as if the lake was simply biding its time on the drive back. I found my thoughts drifting into a fog of questions and half-formed doubts. My heart was still racing, and my muscles remained tense. Marcos occasionally mumbled about how bizarre the noise had been, never quite finishing his sentences. As if he couldn't find the right words to describe it, I gripped the steering wheel with sweaty palms, glancing at the rear view mirror more often than usual, convinced something might be following us. Each time I glanced, is only the empty dirt road unraveling behind you. Say, feeling of nausea welled in my stomach whenever I thought about the dark water and that tortured breathing. Was it a restless spirit, a creature that defies all reason, or was it merely a reflection of our own fears conjured by exhaustion and the eerie solitude? None of these questions had easy answers, and the uncertainty lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. The more it tried to banish it, the deeper it burrowed. Even now, when I recall the events by that lake, my body reacts as if I'm still the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Breath-turning shallows wet, beating on my brow. I can't forget the primal chill that surged through me each time that sigh had chowed over the water, nor can I dismiss the sense that we left something behind. Some intangible piece of ourselves, claimed by the darkness we briefly encountered. Sometimes I think I hear it again in my dreams, that low groan followed by a broken exhale that seems to beg for release. I'm not sure. Some experiences simply refuse to be confined to logical explanations. What haunts me most is the uncanny silence of the morning, the way it offered no closure, no tangible evidence, just a grim reminder that sometimes the things we can't see are the ones that weigh on us the heaviest. Now every so often I catch myself listening for that slow, drawn-out breath in the stillness of night, half convinced it might have followed me home. And if I'm honest, there's a part of me that knows it and lodged in my mind, as persistent as my own heartbeat, each time. If in myself alone in the dark, I waiters, straining. The sound of that impossible sight reveal itself again. I remember stepping out of my cart that late afternoon, feeling the air pressing on my ears with a suffocating quiet. The sun hovered low on the horizon, its orange lights leasing through the dense canopy. There was a sensation of being scrutinized, an eerie awareness that made my skin prickle. Even though I was surrounded by miles of wilderness, with no another soul in sight, I felt cornered, like some invisible presence was crouching just behind me, waiting for the perfect moment to show itself. I was in that part of the forest for a routine work assignment, checking and recalibrating GPS equipment to ensure accurate readings in remote areas. The day had been filled with stops at various coordinates, always under a time crunch. This particular location, however, felt different. My final stop was an old abandoned forest watch tower made entirely of wood. I'd seen a few of these relics before, tall rickety structures built decades ago. Fire lookouts or park rangers, most were decommissioned, sometimes left to rot away in the undergrowth, but I hadn't expected this one to be so imposing or so isolated. When I first glanced at the tower, it looked hauntingly fragile. Even if a strong wind could break it in half, the boards along the sides were gray with age, and the steps leading upward seemed warped. Nevertheless, I had a job to do. I grabbed my gear from the trunk and scanned the area. No signs of human activity, just the endless hush of the forest, punctuated by the distant rustle of leaves. I decided that the best vantage point would be from the tops, so I began my climb, hoping the structure was sturdy enough to hold my weight. As I ascended, the sun's light grew fainter, seeping through the wooden planks and thin beams that danced with dust. Each creak of the steps triggered a jolt in my chest. My heartbeat quickened, a deep sense of unease weighed at me, intensifying with each rung I passed. It felt like I was intruding in a that wanted to remain forgotten, but I kept going, reassuring myself that I would be up and down quickly, just enough to gather the signals. I needed once at the top. I stepped onto a small platform that barely felt secure. I stared out the sweeping view of the dense greenery of the forest. Below undulated in shadowy pockets, while the horizon was blurred by a faint orange glow. Strangely, there was a distinct absence of movement. No hikers, no wildlife that I could see, nothing but static foliage. I set up my GPS device, checking the signal strength, occasionally adjusting the orientation. The only noises were my own shifting feet and the wooden boards groaning under my weight. The sky overhead had begun to shift to a deeper, more ominous shade. I could sense the day dying around Meta King with a tiny warmth or comfort. After finalizing my readings, I climbed back down. My shoulders relaxed a fraction, once my boots touched the ground. Again, the tower loomed overhead, silent, yet full of an indescribable tension. It felt urgent to leave that spot immediately, but I still had a few measurements to confirm beside my vehicles. I popped open the back door, rummaging for a spare battery pack and logging the data on my laptop. That was the moment. With a stark motion, less silhouette at the top of the tower. A dark figure standing against the fading daylight. My breath snagged in my throat. I had just been there seconds ago, and I hadn't passed anyone on the narrow stairs. The figure didn't move for a moment. Just watched my legs tensed. Islam made the door shut, the hollow clang echoing off the trees. The silhouette turned its head sharply as if startled, and then vanished from the parapet with unsettling speed. A cold wave of panic washed over me. My heart thudded hard. I could feel it against my ribcage. It tried to rationalize. Maybe someone else had been around, hidden in a blind spot. Or maybe they had climbed up when I wasn't looking. My mind churned out possible explanations, but none felt convincing. The precarious, old, and possibly unsafe concern, or curiosity, maybe both, pushed me to hurry back up. I told myself that I would offer help if there was someone up there who might have stumbled up on the place, or at least confirm I wasn't hallucinating. I bolted up the steps, breathing hard, each wooden plank rattling beneath my feet. By the time I reached the top, my shirt was soaked with sweat. My palms were damp, clinging to the splintered railing. I glanced around frantically. Noon the wind had picked up, it causing the tower to sway slightly. My heart hammered in my ears, and I felt a suffocating heat at the back of my neck. The platform was deserted, as was the small room used once for observation. Dust coated every surface, and old bulletins on the wall were so dead they were unreadable. It was impossible that anybody could have hidden there without me noticing. Still, I felt watched, as if eyes were on me from some impossible angle. I descended again this time, struggling to control the tremors in my legs. My throat was sodry. I could barely swallow. Nothing made sense, yet the urgency to wrap my work overshadowed the confusion. I forced myself to focus on finalizing the GPS checks. My hands shook as it typed notes into my laptop. The breeze against the trees sounded sinister, like hushed voices conspiring just beyond my understanding. The forest that had once felt merely solitary was now claustrophobic, pressing in on me with a psychic evenness. Eventually, I managed to stow all the equipment and slam my trunk shut. That muffled bang reverberated unnaturally, and in the emptiness, as thought the woods absorbed the sound and replied with a low, ominous murmur. I slipped into the driver's seat, but before starting the engine, I couldn't resist taking a final look at the tower through the windshield. Dusk had fallen, and only the suggestion of its form was visible, a black outline. Against the twilight sky, I stared at that shape, half expecting silhouette to appear, but nothing happened. My chest felt crushed by the oppressive sense that this place was not done with me. I had the canny feeling I was leaving something behind, or that something was following me. The drive back to the main road was a nightmare in itself. Dirt paths twisted through thick stands-off trees, and the headlights threw frantic shadows along the trunks, creating the illusion of figures darting between them. My breathing remained rapid, and it tried to calm my racing thoughts by mentally reviewing my notes, but every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see someone sitting in the back seat or the outline of a face at the window. The only thing I perceived was my own paler reflection, wide-eyed and drenched in perspiration, when I reached a paved road at last. A sliver of relief threaded through mess streetlights were scarce but better than none, and the realization offered a frail comfort. I found a motel on the outskirts of a small town, and checked in. The clerk barely looked up, just handed me key. I might have mumbled something about how quiet it was out there, but I can't recall exactly. My voice came out in a shaky monotone, and I'm not sure if the clerk even noticed my anxiety. Exhaustion gripped me, so I headed straight to my room. Without further thought, inside the fluorescent lights flickered as it turned the switch, momentarily plunging the room into darkness. Before steadying, the air smelled stale, and the walls were covered in peeling floral wallpaper. I locked the door, set my laptop down, and sat at the edge of the bed, trying to gather my composure. My ears still rang with the silence of that forest clearing every time I closed my eyes. I envisioned the tower's silhouette, the shadowy figure turning its head in my direction. My skin felt fevered, and I noticed a slight tremor in my hands. It tried to force myself into a routine to calm down. I placed the laptop on the night, intending to review my data, but my mind refused to focus on anything but that tower. My thoughts looped back to the moment I'd seen that shape disappear. How could anyone vanish so quickly on a cramped platform at the top of Arikiti Watch Tower? And how could I find not race of them when I returned? It turned on the TV for background noise, hoping the static mumble would provide some distraction. But every meaningless commercial only heightened my sense of foreboding. Occasionally, I thought I heard creaks in the hallway, footsteps that halted right outside my door. My heart would pound, and I'd stare at the gap under the door, expecting to see shadows, yet it remained empty. And I'd remind myself that old buildings made all sorts of noises still. Each crack in the silence gnawed at my nerves. In the middle of the night, I jolted awake. Apparently I had dozed off. With the lights on, my mouth was parched and my pulse hammered as if I'd been running for miles. Sweat clung to me skin. A damp sheet of flicker of movement outside the thin curtains caught my attention. I froze, my breath stuck in my throat. I could make out a silhouette against the dim illumination of the parking lot. It looked taller than average, or perhaps it was just the distorted angle. There was a brief shift, and then it vanished from the window's edge. My stomach twisted. I couldn't bring myself to check outside. I stayed there, paralyzed. The hairs on my arms, standing on end, hours seemed to blur into a half-waking nightmare. Every shuffle or distant door slam at the motel made me twitch. My mind played cruel tricks. Imagine that figure stepping down the hallway, passing under the humming lights, gliding closer whenever I mustered the courage to approach the door's peephole. His unknown, the corridor lay vacant. Eventually exhaustion won out, and he slipped into a restless sleep, plagued by disjointed images of the tower and the forest in those dreams. The watchtower loomed impossibly tall, and I climbing its stairs only to find a mirror at the top, instead of an observation deck. But the reflection in the mirror wasn't my own. It was the silhouette, still and faceless, tilting its head in my direction. Come morning, a dull headache weighed on me like a physical burden. I felt far from rested, but the daylight brought a shred of courage. I gathered my belongings, checked out quickly, and got back on the road. My next assignments were in other more populated areas, which gave me some relief. Yet throughout the drive, a nagging paranoia clung to me. I kept glancing at the side mirror shaft, convinced I'd see that shape tailing me from a distance. Over the following days, my anxiety refused to subside. I found myself looking over my shoulder whenever I entered a new site for work. The faint rustle of leaves or the scrape of a branch against my car made me heart jump. In passing conversation, a colleague mentioned that I seemed wunged, and I mumbled something about lack of sleep. I avoided describing the tower entirely, feeling that nobody would believe me, or they'd dismiss it as exhaustion-induced paranoia. If I admitted what I'd seen event to myself, it meant acknowledging something beyond logical explanation. That sense of being watched never fully left me during quiet moments. I sometimes got the impression that if it turned around fast enough, I would catch a glimpse of that figure. A presence weighed on my peripheral vision like a smudge. I couldn't wipe away. My nights became an uneasy blend of insomnia and fretful dreams, each one circling back to that solitary tower in the wilderness. Sometimes in those dreams, I would look out from the platform and see me car below with me still standing by it, gazing up. It was like I was watching myself through some other entity's eyes. So each time I'd wake with my heartbeat pounding and sweat soaking my sheets. So eventually I completed my work trip, collected all required data, and returned home. The comfort of my apartment offered some security, yet in the darkness of my living room with the blinds drawn, I could still envision that tower and the figure on the parapet. Late at night, I would get the creeping sensation of eyes on my back forcing me to spin around, only to find my furniture cast in moonlit shape. Even walking through my own hallway felt nerve-wracking, as if the wooden floor might creak and reveal an unseen watcher trailing behind me. The days turned into weeks, and while the raw terror ebbed, disquieting memory persisted. I couldn't stop myself from replaying every detail in my mind: the rotted stairs, the encroaching sunset, the hush of the forest, as I left the unmistakable outline of that stranger. If it was even a stranger standing so still and turning its head at me, I entertained the idea that I had conjured some hallucination due to stress, but the vividness refused to be dismissed. That haunted, lonely watchtower felt more real than many of the everyday routines I went through since coming home. Even now, I occasionally wake in the middle of the night, certain I've heard a floorboard creak. My pulse quickens as I strain to hear any further movement. There's nothing, just the faint hum of their refrigerator or the distant noise of cars outside. Still, a chill wraps around my spine, and I recall the oppressive hush of that clearing. I imagine what it would feel like to stand at the foot of the tower, again looking up and seeing that silhouette peering down at me. It never reported any strange sightings to the authorities, nor did I return to that location. Something in me persists, the thought of going back, as if that place is best abandoned. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if the figure is still there, resolutely occupying the top platform, waiting. Perhaps it continues to watch travelers who stray too closer, revealing itself only for an instant before disappearing into the old structure's dusty gloom. Or maybe it left along with me, and I'm doomed to sense its silent vigil in my peripheral. For as long as I live, no matter how much time passes, the thought of that watchtower triggers a dull chi of dread in my chest. My stomach knots whenever the memory surfaces, and my palms sweat at the recollection of that fleeting shape dissolving into thin air. The entire experience remains etched into my mind like a chronological explanation offers any closure. I'm left with a lingering, persistent question: was there really someone or something watching me that evening, or was it my own fear made manifest in the waning daylight? I'm not sure which answer would bring less comfort. What I do know is that my life hasn't been the same since. The lingering unease follows me in quiet moments, and I often feel compelled to check over my shoulder or glance at the windows. There's no telling if this sense of being observed is psychological or something far stranger, and every time I think of that tower, I feel the raw thud of my heart all over again, as though I'm still standing there gazing up at a place that seems alive with secrets it will never share. Perhaps it's best that I never learn the truth behind that silent silhouette, but one thing is skex. Retain some presences, unseen, countered, refuse to be forgotten, and if you ever find yourself in a similar place alone in the twilight high above the tree line in a forgotten watchtower, be careful where you look and be prepared for what might look back. Thank you for listening to tonight's tale here at Darkened Fables Tales. If the shadows haven't crept in too deep, leave a like and tell me in the comments, what do you think was in that house? Sleep well.